Everyone, this is the December 11th work session of the Portland City Council. And colleagues, this is scheduled to take approximately 3 hours. And so what I'd propose is about an hour and a half in, we take a few minutes break, let everybody stretch, and then reconvene. So colleagues, in the September work session, we kicked off our Housing Opportunities Initiative. The initiative included Better Housing by Design, the Residential Infill Project, and the Anti-Displacement Action Plan. These policy proposals complement our other smart growth strategies in the city, and we agree that we must prioritize these things in order to address both the housing crisis today and for future generations of Portlanders. Our offices have been working closely with city staff to advance the Better Housing by Design recommended policy. And after our work session today, we'll continue that effort. Now we're turning our sights to the land type that makes up the majority of the city of Portland's area. That's single dwelling residential areas. The residential infill project is 4 years in the making, and it revamps our zoning tools to increase supply and the options of housing types. We need more housing options that are less expensive, smaller in size to accommodate both changing family sizes, and we also need other types of homes to take advantage of Portland's narrow lots. Because the truth is, too many Portlanders struggle to find an affordable house or apartment to buy or rent. And the vast majority of them are people of color who've been historically marginalized and left out of wealth creation. That's why I believe today's work session is so critically important. Around the time we kicked off the Housing Opportunities Initiative, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability released its report called The Historical Context of Racist Planning, that provides us with a much clearer understanding of how we got to the housing inequities that we see in our community today. Portland has a long-standing history of racist housing, and yes, I use that word intentionally, and land use practices that have created or exacerbated segregation, accelerated displacement, and prevented wealth creation for our communities of color. While some of these practices were conducted with outright discriminatory intent, others resulted in discriminatory outcomes that continue to perpetuate disparities today. The city's first State of Housing in Portland report showed that housing options are severely limited for lower income households, people of color, single mothers, and seniors. While the report was not on its face surprising, it is a constant reminder for me that we must bring Portlanders together to correct this long-standing injustice. As we continue to look at new land use and housing policies, it's necessary that we take a moment to reflect on our history. Until we can acknowledge and understand that history, we cannot work together to move forward together. I want to thank Commissioner Hardesty, and welcome back. We're glad to have you back, for acknowledging this need as policies in the Housing Opportunity Initiative come before the City Council. I also want to thank the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability staff, especially the report's author, Jenna Hughes, and the report advisors who ensured accuracy in the findings. Before we kick off the next few months of the residential infill project, let's listen to Bureau staff about our history. I invite you to join me in asking what role the city, in this instance, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, will play in working to advance racial justice. Before I turn it over to Director Durbin, I'd like to give my colleagues the opportunity to make any opening remarks they'd like to, if so, or at any time, of course, during the discussion. Very good. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm Andrea Durbin, the Planning and Sustainability Director. We're excited to bring this report to you and share the findings and have this discussion. Our vision for Portland is a future that is prosperous, healthy, equitable, and resilient. We realize this vision is not the current lived experience of communities of color in Portland, and definitely not the experience of most Black Portlanders. To create a more inclusive city and address longstanding disparities, we needed to look again at the record and the role of past planning, zoning, and development decisions had in creating the inequitable landscape and opportunities that is Portland today. The Bureau of Planning and Sustainability of today is committed to lead with racial equity. And to be honest, we are deep in the process to understand exactly what that means and how to do that with community partners. The outcomes we seek is that all residents participate in and benefit from new growth and wealth in all forms. One of the main barriers we must confront is the historical, structural, and institutional racism that has created deep inequities that continue to harm Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color in our community. We see this translate into many disparities in our community, from home ownership, health outcomes, income levels, educational opportunities, employment opportunities, to name just some. So today we share with you a historical review of harm and disparities caused by city zoning, land use, and development policies and practices to better understand the past and to ensure that the past informs our present analysis, understanding, and actions. Joe Zender and Tony Lamb will lead us through the story and the lessons we have taken from it. First, the legacy of past policy is still present. Our city is zoned and developed in a way that still benefits privileged white homeowners more than others. And one of the greatest challenges for Black households are the lack of opportunities. Second, exclusionary zoning and economics in some neighborhoods contributes to displacement in others. What is clear is that zoning reform is a necessary part of the answer, but it is not enough alone to undo historical inequities. We will share some ideas about what we can do to address these historical harms and ensure a more equitable future for all Portlanders. The presentation that Joe and Tony will walk us through will take about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for conversation and questions. Obviously, if you have clarifying questions during the presentation, we invite you to ask them. And with that, I'll turn it to Joe and Tony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm going to dive right into presenting the content of the study. Since we're a work session, you're not seeing the screen behind you, but we've given you copies of a slide deck that we're using to do the presentation. And as Tony and I go through it, we'll walk you through it today. But first, can I flip it? Thanks. Just in some context of this story you're going to hear has had all the characteristics that the mayor's opening comments and Andrea's said, but also one we wanted that sort of informed our writing of the report, or Jenna's writing of the report, was the acknowledgement that there's already a federal requirement that cities go beyond simply not discriminating. That's obvious, but also to trying to address historical segregation. This work is informing our sort of ability to step up to that policy requirement. The way we're going to tell the story is chronologically. Starting racial segregation has impacted just about every aspect of Black experience in Portland from the earliest days of the Oregon Territory. I think most of you know that history. From the start, the options that Black households had in Portland, where they could live and work, were largely dictated by Portland's white majority. So it should be no surprise that planning and zoning initial uses or history were used this way too. We're going to tell this story today. Tony will starting from the early 20th century and work our way through the current comp plan. It's a story of explicitly racist act, but also a deeply rooted institutional racism. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thank you. First, I want to remind everyone what we mean by zoning. Zoning is a tool that cities use to guide how land is developed. Originally, the focus of zoning was the arrangement and separation of land uses for public health and safety, with strong racial and class dynamics undergirding their creation and subsequent enforcement. However, in the early 20th century, white leaders in southern and eastern states used zoning to segregate their cities by legislating separate areas for Black and white households. By the 1917, this type of zoning was declared unconstitutional and illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Buchanan versus Worley. However, many cities found workarounds and continued to segregate using other zoning tactics. Additionally, this decision did not apply to private agreements such as restrictive real estate covenants. Before the zoning code was even adopted, racially restrictive covenants were written into real estate deeds. These covenants were used to prohibit persons of color from using or owning the land. They were often applied to new residential developments. For instance, if you look at your packet, we have an example from the Laurelhurst neighborhood in 1913. There's some text on that document underlined in red. It states, "Nor shall the same or any part thereof be in any manner used or occupied by Chinese, Japanese, or Negroes, except that persons of said races may be employed as servants by residents." If we look further down in the underlined black text, we also see the removal of particular use types within this property. And that states that the property cannot be used for flats, apartments, stables, stores, or business or manufacturing purposes. So though these covenants were declared unenforceable in 1948 by the U.S. Supreme Court, alternative means of segregation were utilized to ensure similar outcomes. From the start, with Portland's history, where black households could live were extremely limited. In 1919, rules were added to the Real Estate Industry Code of Ethics that prohibited the selling or giving of loans to both Black and Asian Americans for purchase of homes in white neighborhoods. This rule was not removed from the Code of Ethics until 1956. At the turn of the century, Lower Albina became a neighborhood open to Black residents. It was older, less expensive, and became one of the only places where Black residents could buy homes in Portland. By the late 1930s, more than half of the 2,000 Black residents of Portland lived in Lower Albina. And during World War II, jobs in the shipyards brought many more Black residents to Portland. Many found housing in Vanport, which is a public housing project for shipyard and other workers that was never built with the idea of permanence in mind. However, many Black households continued to live in Vanport after the war employment boom, as more permanent housing options were not available for Black households. As many are familiar, in 1948, Vanport was tragically swept away by a massive flood. I do want to make clear that we remember that this tragedy was not simply due to an unforeseen natural disaster. It was also the result of explicit and intentional decisions to build and keep poor quality temporary housing for Black workers and their families in a flood hazard zone. So as a result of this flood, those Black households that could relocated to Albina, which was their only choice in Portland, while white residents moved out. And by the end of the 1950s, there were 23,000 fewer white residents and 7,000 more Black residents in Albina than there had been at the beginning of the decade.
Could you do us a favor and just let us know if you, yeah,
Certainly.
switch slides.
Slide
Just-
7.
Yeah, tell us that's helpful, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Definitely, thank you.
It's good exercise. It's like yoga.
So now on slide 7, in 1924, Portland adopted its first zoning code. In this code, it only had 2 residential designations, Zone 1 for single family and Zone 2 for multifamily. Looking at this map here, the single family zone shown in yellow was only applied to the 15, and I put quotes around this, highest quality neighborhoods, and was applied to these areas at the request of property owners. The 1924 map still had a significant amount of multifamily zoning outside of these neighborhoods. So everywhere else outside of that yellow area was multifamily. And this was largely due to the 1912 Greater Portland Plan, which projected that Portland's population would reach 2 million residents by 1940. Slight overestimation.
Thank goodness.
Flipping to the next page. After the Great Depression, the Federal Homeowners Loan Association created maps that used neighborhood ratings of, again, in quotes, desirability to determine whether banks should make home loans and at what terms in a particular area.
I'm sorry, who did you say made this?
The Homeowners Loan Association, the Federal Homeowners Loan Association.
So this is a federal act?
Yes, ma'am. And I just also want to point out with those rules that these loans were not available or carried more onerous stipulations and requirements for Black residents. So the map on this page shows some of the ratings shows the ratings in the city of Portland from 1937. And I'm going to quickly run through what those colors mean. So the green areas are considered green line areas, which is the inverse of redlining, but they were considered the best areas. The blue areas were still desirable, yellow were definitely declining, and red were considered hazardous. And just want to make clear that even in areas where the housing stock was in good shape, they were redlined if the percentage of people of color was high. And typically, the red line areas were the city's most diverse areas. This map also shows that the original single-family zones from the 1920s, which were shown on the previous slide, are rated green and blue predominantly. Flipping the page. We have a couple copies of some of the original assessor's notes that make the racial and land use bias of this system very clear. The top example is from Albina, which was redlined and given a grade of D-. And the underlined text states the following. It's zoned multifamily residential and business. This area constitutes Portland's, in quotes, melting pot, and is the nearest approach to a, quote, slum district in the city. 3/4 of the Negro population of the city reside here. In addition, there are some 300 Orientals, 1,000 Southern Europeans, and Russians. I think it's important in that particular statement, you notice the dichotomy of calling out a value we espouse of being a melting pot, while in the same sentence pointing out or classifying this area as a slum district. The bottom example comes from the Kings Heights neighborhood, which was green-lined and given an A+. And the underlined text there states that deed restrictions have expired, but is zoned single-family residential, which with terrain and price levels is believed to be ample protection to maintain single-family zoning. Next page. Here we have a photo of Robert Moses, who's a famous and powerful New York-based planning and development consultant. He was brought to Portland in the 1940s to draft the Portland Improvement Plan. Moses proposed modernizing Portland with freeways and increasing single-family residential zoning. And at the end of his report, he concludes that only a very small percentage of the area of the city should be set apart from multiple dwellings. And this is rather reflective of thinking at the time. And this particular approach continued with the 1959 zoning code, which significantly increased the amount of city limited to single-family development.
Thanks, Tony. So I'll pick it up here to take us into more contemporary era of planning. First, the 60s and 70s on page 11. The focus during this area for urban development programs shifted to address housing discrimination and community engagement. This slide lists some of the milestones of legislation and acts during that period. In Portland, the Albina community participated in the federal Model Cities program, and this was part of a new model of community development coming out of the war on poverty. It had a requirement for grassroots engagement, and that attracted the involvement of Black residents and leaders and organizations in that Albina planning effort many of whom are still advocating for Albina today. This period also was the start of the Oregon land use system that required cities to have a comprehensive growth management plan. And so the next pieces of our history go into Portland's use of that plan. Next, slide 12. But before we started on our first comprehensive plan in the 70s, and the Portland planners drafted something called the population strategy. That strategy focused on how to address the great concerns of this time. So this is to help put it in context, which were disinvestment and white flight. Leaders at the time made it their priority to retain and attract employed, middle-class, educated people with children to reverse white flight. The actions focused on protecting housing and neighborhood character that was attractive to these households. Next, this same sort of thinking was carried into the first city's first comprehensive plan in 1980. Leaders were still concerned about disinvestment, and what they saw is the negative impact of 60s-style infill development in single-family neighborhoods. As a result, the plan continued to use the single-dwelling zoning, single-family zoning as a strategy, not just to house people, but to protect community stability and property values. For example, in the slide that's on page 13 here, you can see a piece of the zoning map of the city from before the 1980 comp plan. And this shows, you can see a Ladd's addition at the bottom. It goes basically from Division up to Burnside on the east side. And those areas that are circled in blue are multifamily zones. With the adoption of the 80s comp plan, that multifamily zone on all these sort of really close-in neighborhood areas was stripped away and made into a single-family category. However, this period too, there was a lot of change during the 80s comp plan. This was when the city itself first became to explicitly embrace being a compact, walkable urban development and having that kind of density, and to do that instead of trying to compete with the suburbs. Remember, they're worried about white flight and disinvestment, so we have to be suburban, but Portland made a different choice, or started to. That's in this plan. You also see the start of centers and corridors designations throughout the neighborhoods, where we use this multifamily zoning to increase density. But since our ethic was still to protect neighborhoods, primarily single-family character of the adjacent neighborhoods, those strips of multifamily zoning often are a property or half a property deep, stretched along these corridors. The priority, yeah.
I need to ask the question.
Sure,
Before
Commissioner.
you get too far ahead, I don't want to bring us back to the 40s, but I need to go back to 45 at the end of World War II. That was when the Veterans Bill was created, right? And the Veterans Bill was not created equally. It was two Veterans Bills, right? There's one for white folks and there's one for everybody else, right? And so that is not reflected here because I think that's a kind of a missing piece of the history as to why some people could afford to buy homes and some people couldn't.
Thanks, Commissioner. You know, this is one of the hazards with doing a history like this, but all of our presentations, we're getting good feedback from people. Like the piece that keeps leaping out to me that we left out too is the whole Lower Albina demolition for Memorial Coliseum, that whole period too. There are many acts along the way. We chose to focus on sort of land use decision, right? So, so the story is not just the storyline we're giving you here today.
So to be clear for context, then you're talking about land use decisions. You're not talking about urban renewal, for example, and some of those exercises.
Well, you'll see when we get to interstate, just where they intersect with implementing a plan.
Okay, great, thank you.
There were lots of, right, this is not the history of the use of urban renewal in the city. That story's been told
So
as well.
your focus here today is on zoning
Yeah.
issues? Okay,
And
that's
because
helpful
in part,
context.
we were writing this up to be able to reflect back on the kind of decisions and policies we bring forward to you all and learn from this.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Slide 14. After this comprehensive plan period, we moved to a new program called the Community Planning Program in the 90s. And really what the motivation of this was, as much as anything, was that Metro 2040 plan for greater density, compact development, this vision that we're still implementing in our region was adopted. And our responsibility was to update the zoning of the 80s comp plan to implement that policy. And we're going to do it through a series of these, series of these area plans and work our way around the entire city. In the end, the outcomes played out really differently from these plans in different parts of the city. And one of the outcomes you can see is that the new compact development policies were applied first and probably most aggressively to communities that had less political power, lower incomes and higher concentration of Black residents. And the program, which ended in the Southwest Community Plan, never got to updating, bringing those kind of policies into the rest of the neighborhoods of the city. So first up was the Albina Plan in '93, and this was an award-winning, community-informed plan that tackled a wide range of issues. At its time, it was a model for trying to do that kind of planning in a city, more or less a city the size of Portland. It was a national model. In terms of land use parts of it, though, it called for rezoning major streets as a way to reverse disinvestment, up the density. Even the community community voices supported this, up the density, attract investment, promote neighborhood progress, and we did this on Vancouver and Williams and Mississippi and Interstate. And of course, much of that zoning, which has been in place since then, we didn't see really start to blossom or happen until recently. The Albina Plan also, though, called for programs and public investments as well as... Sure,
Because I know you're on the flow here, but again, talk about knitting the pieces together. After the Albina Community Plan was developed, then there was this decision made, land use decision made, to put a median down the middle of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And that was so that folks who lived in Vancouver could get there quicker, right? To and back quicker. And so what that did was basically destroy the business community that existed there forever without government support or investments, right? So put the median down, took all the parking out, and then there was nowhere for people to park, so those businesses closed down. And ironically, the median went out just as white people started wanting to come back in inner Northeast Portland. The medians disappeared, and all of a sudden, you could park on the street again. So I know too much, unfortunately, because I lived during the Albina Community Plan time. I actually worked for Beth Stein then and helped the county with that portion of the plan. So again, if we're going to tell the story, right, it really, and you guys did a great job. So I'm not dismissing what you've done, but when you've lived here as long as I have, you have some institutional knowledge that needs to inform this conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, when we present this, we're often standing in front of people who've been parts of this different history, and this is not necessarily our story to tell. We weren't there, so we appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so the second part of the Albina part of this story is that the plan itself called for not just zoning, but programs and public investments as well as the zoning. And however, in the end, the zoning was put in place and the actions to protect households from displacement were underfunded and inadequate. This is in part not just from local decision-making. Remember, this was also the period where the federal funding for cities collapsed, and also when we had the Oregon state land use tax revolts, so resources were diminishing. Second up was the Outer Southeast Plan. So this covers the area that we commonly call East Portland today. This area was annexed in the city in the 80s. It had big infrastructure needs, and it was also seen as a great location to start advancing these density goals that we got with the Metro 2040 plan. So in doing the Outer Southeast Plan, you got a great deal of multifamily zoning introduced into the map. That's partially what you all have been talking about through Better Housing by Design. Better Housing by Design, in part, was focused to come back and improve the quality of what we did at this time in the 90s. Finally, the last of the community plans to happen was the Southwest Community Plan, and it was the most controversial. It resulted in some multifamily rezoning, but preserved much of the existing single-family zoning. And without a doubt, part of its legacy is that the power of the neighborhood made a difference in the outcomes, one of which was the end of the community planning program. It became to be too controversial for the city to believe that it was really going to get this work done that way. Another of the outcomes is that since 2000, there's been about 8,500 new housing units built in the Albina Community Plan area, and only about 4,000 built in Southwest Plan area, and half of those were in the South Portland neighborhood.
Could I ask you a question, just out of curiosity? What are the numbers that are assigned to each of the neighborhoods?
You know, when those areas were created, Mayor, they just gave them
Is it just like a zone number or something?
Yeah, they correspond roughly to maybe how we even do the coalitions now, but it was that kind of effort. We defined 7 community planning districts, Central City, and then 6, or it looks like we have 8, Central City and 8 others, 7 others.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, next. In the 90s, the next up, though, came the opportunity for some more additional resources to implement the Albina Plan. And this was through the Interstate Urban Renewal Plan. The community saw this, based on the reporting at the time, as both an opportunity and a threat. It was an opportunity. The opportunity was the chance to have some resources to implement the Albina Plan. But the primary impetus for the urban renewal area was not from within the community. It was motivated by our collective repeated failure to gain voter support for light rail funding. So in the end, the yellow line, that was the transit line that was under development at the time, the interstate line, funding took precedent over neighborhood priorities, leaving, again, some of the promises made in the Albina Plan unimplemented. Specifically, the housing strategy based from the Urban Renewal Plan was based on the Albina Plan. It forecast the need for about 2,000 units of affordable housing in the area. The city was only able to deliver 600 of those to date. And also from 1990 to 2016, about 10,000 Black residents were displaced from the neighborhood. So clearly, the zoning was not sufficient. The other programs that could have made a difference did not receive funding.
And let me just say, there wasn't a housing crisis when that happened. No one peeped.
So that's, and there's a, so the next phase is in the 2000s. And it was 2 periods, 2 big projects that were community-wide, community-wide visioning projects with significant engagement. Vision PDX in 2008 really marked a change in the ambition that we had to bring more people into and underrepresented groups into defining a shared vision for Portland. And the Portland Plan from 2012 was supposed to be a strategic plan, so it reached beyond just land use and development into education and other topics. But one of its big legacies is that it established racial equity as a citywide priority, sort of gave, and a group of people advocating for that to be in the plan who are still active in our policymaking here sort of stepped up to do that. It also coincided with the creation of the Office of Equity and Human Rights, so this was a moment in the Portland Plan. The last sort of piece I wanted to mention about the Equity Foundation is that it added a focus on evaluating when we make decisions, who benefits and who bears the costs or impacts of our decisions and investments, and that's still carrying through till today. Next on slide 17, we take a look at our current comprehensive plan, which we all just completed. That focus of racial equity that we had from the Portland Plan was carried into that plan. An important example of how that shows up in our new comprehensive plan is in the equitable development and the housing policies that are included in that plan. And this slide lists, just a sampling of those. But this sort of suite of equitable development housing policies is important, not just because of what they're trying to do, but also because, especially the anti-displacement pieces are in the plan because of advocacy from the community. The Anti-Displacement PDX Coalition of community groups. This is an example of the other principle that's built into the comp plan of that changes. When we're doing changes, we need to include Portland residents who are at greatest risk of being impacted by those, in this case, displacement, in making those planning and development decisions. Slide 18 is just sort of to say, since we've adopted, and actually even before we adopted the comprehensive plan, the city's been very active in implementing those policies, those equitable development and anti-displacement policies. And this is just a list of some of that activity. You can see much of it is in response to the housing emergency. A lot of this is projects of the work of the Housing Bureau, and includes both housing production and rental protections. It includes the next generation of equitable development efforts, such as being done by Prosper Portland and the Southwest Equitable Development Strategy that's going with the new transit line, the new version of that investment.
Just before you go to the next session, I think this is really a vital place to be. We're talking about the 2035 comprehensive plan. You just mentioned the making sure that people aren't displaced again. I have to ask this question: what makes us think that we're going to be different this time? Because what you just laid out is not once have we gotten this right. Why would this time be any different than all the other times that we've said fancy words and put nice stuff on paper? What's going to be different this time?
Commissioner, it depends on the choices that we're facing, just to be honest. And this is just my observation of this.
But what are we going to do, based on what we know now, right, about this history?
Right.
I guess my fear is like the anti-displacement plan, which is why I was an advocate that had to happen first, right, before we start passing all these other zone changes, because our history shows us that if we don't do that first, what's going to happen is those who can least afford it are going to be the ones that are going to be priced out once again.
Yeah, and so one of the things I think that I feel like we've seen in taking a look back at this history is that it's not just a zoning change. You got to take a look at the context of the time and the place. What part of the reason it was so impactful for Albina community when we did that zoning change and since then was that whole stack of discrimination that community faced, both financially, in terms of choice of a place to live, in terms of access to power. And so that it wasn't just a zoning piece in there. It was, as much as anything, when looking at the planning and zoning piece failures, it was having a plan that actually even saw zoning could actually help bring investment, and we got to couple it with something, and we never could deliver on the other parts of it. So as we're going forward, we got to keep our eye in parts on that, I think. Timing as well. Maybe we can learn from this history to try to get ahead of some of these things. So, sorry.
No, I appreciate that. And I guess I hope what you're hearing is my fear that as someone who is very involved with the Albina Community Plan, I know that every government within the Multnomah County area signed off on the Albina Community Plan. Each government said that they had a responsibility for different pieces. And as always happens, political leadership changes, priorities change, new people come in and they have a new vision about what they want to do. And so I know enough because as I said, I was around when the Albina Community Plan, which was a milestone. The thousands of hours community members put into creating that plan, the commitments made by every single government, and not one of them kept one of the promises that they made. And so when you talked about urban renewal with the interstate, I don't believe that that was part of the Albina plan. That was all about light rail and bringing light rail into a community that didn't have light rail, right? The Albina Community Plan was not about light rail. It was about how do you make sure that those who lived in Albina were able to still live there. And so I'm not trying to kill the messenger, right? But I just want to be really clear that we can't pretend that somehow because we now have a statement about racial equity and planning on our document that somehow the outcomes, because developers right now are lining up and they're doing stuff and they don't have a racial equity concern, right? They have money and they're going to build what they're going to build. I'm concerned that we're going to end up here. I won't be here because I'm old now, but 20 years from now, some people will be sitting in this room going, oh, what happened to the 2035 plan, right? Where did it fail?
And if I can add, Commissioner, I absolutely understand your level of skepticism. I think what we're hoping to do here and through the anti-displacement work and focus and the task force that we're doing jointly with community is really to look at what are the different tools and strategies that we have and begin to bake that in and really incorporate this focus of how do we keep people in place, be very much more proactive in when we're looking at whether it's zoning changes and trying to build that into policies from the very beginning, and also looking at what the different tools and strategies that are available for the city and how do we deploy them. So I think, we're obviously at the very beginning of this work, but this is, there's been a lot done, and we're looking at how do we do more in terms of deepening kind of the different programs that we have and the strategies that we can actually deploy.
I share Commissioner Hardisty's concerns.
Yeah.
That we haven't done very much on anti-displacement, and there's this rush to move forward with residential infill when we don't have those strategies in place. We don't have to do residential infill till June of 2022. So why we would rush forward with making all the zoning code changes when, as we've seen time and time and time again, it hasn't worked out well in the past, there's no need to do that.
Well, and we'll talk about residential infill more specifically later this afternoon, but I think it is important for us all to remember that because of some of the changes that we've built into that zoning change, that actually, the residential infill will decrease displacement across the city. So residential infill is, in part, an anti-displacement strategy.
Not in every neighborhood. We know that from the
Absolutely,
studies.
not in every, if you're
In
looking
some
from
of the
a
most
city
low-income
perspective, absolutely.
mixed.
And we need to talk more about that, but we can talk, we'll get to residential info more specifically.
So, yeah.
I think we have a couple
Can
more.
we just, can we?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a few things to say about
course,
anti-displacement as well, and I'm wondering if I should chime in now or wait until the end.
Absolutely up to you, Commissioner, what you would like to do. We will have.
Have like 6 more. We have some
Okay,
data.
I'll just say, I share Commissioner Hardisty's and Commissioner Fritz's concerns, and I have some specific suggestions that I'll hold till the end.
Great, that'd be great. Thank you, Commissioner.
Great. So can we have just a little bit more and come back, because this is the discussion that we were hoping to have. So Tony, sorry.
Thank you.
So, and we're on slide 19.
Slide 19, first in a series of maps. So to wrap up, we want to look at how the impact of past racist practices are still present in today's outcomes. So the next few maps show the original single-family zoned areas from the 1927 zoning code have remained economically stable and demographically homogeneous. They are still predominantly white. So looking at this map, those areas in yellow have the highest concentrations of white population within the city. Overlaying on that, the black outlines are those 15 original neighborhoods zoned for single family. Flipping the page, we see that they are still among the most affluent areas in the city, and yet have experienced great stability and little change over time. So this map is looking at the concentration of household income. So areas with a darker shading are places where there are higher percentages of households making 140% or greater of the median family income. Flipping the page, these areas are also have the lowest number of households at risk of losing housing due to economic pressures. This is a kind of complicated map, so I'm going to walk through this. So we have groups vulnerable to housing inequity or insecurity, excuse me. So if an area ranks in these 4 factors, the 4 factors being renter households, a high proportion of low-income households, a high proportion of residents of color, and a high proportion of residents lacking a 4-year degree, then they show up darker on the map. So when we look at those 15 areas, they are shaded lighter, so there's more stability and affluence in those areas, less risk of displacement. Turning the page to the next map, in areas of stability and exclusion, and where the city has gentrified, white households have benefited more. As home values have grown, white homeowners have disproportionately benefited from the wealth created by the federal home mortgage tax deduction. For generations, the mortgage interest deduction has publicly subsidized expensive homes owned by the highest income earners who pass this wealth on to the next generation. And the next map, turning the page, and while property values have grown across the city, they remain higher in historically green-lined areas, which are predominantly white. They have also grown in red-lined areas, such as Albina. But here the story is a bit different. the historically black neighborhoods of Albina had already experienced the impacts of massive land clearance from the late 1950s into the 1970s, followed by disinvestment in the poor economic years of the 1980s. Recent growth in Albina has been driven by a large influx of relatively young, affluent white residents, leading to gentrification and displacement that has again pushed the city's black population northward and eastward. The next page. Where there were 3 majority black census tracts in inner northeast Portland in 2000, there are now none within the Portland city limits. And in this regard, the 1977 population strategy, which Joe mentioned earlier, which centered white, educated, and economically secure households as who we wanted in our city, has been an overwhelming success to the detriment of others, and especially black households. So while we no longer have covenants restricting black people from living here, our current system still has a similar outcome.
Great. 3 more slides, and I think this sets up the discussion we were just starting to have. What have we learned from this, and what can we make from it? First, the legacy of these past planning policy, these past choices is present. That's what the data, the outcomes that Tony just showed, illustrate clearly. What's that mean? Well, for current zoning patterns, still benefit privileged white homeowners more than others. And in many ways, they reinforce the past harms to the black community. And a big one, especially for the current situation, the current kind of choices we're facing, which is in a market-based economy, is that black households from those past decisions for generations were denied the opportunity to build intergenerational wealth, right? Because you couldn't get financing. Home ownership is less, we know to this very day, and a lot of this history we just looked at, especially the redlining period and the like, are the reasons for that. So even today, when we're talking about a zoning change, we're not just changing zoning as if nothing else happened. We're building on a foundation where that is true, and it's from years of decisions, and it's distinctly different for this community in that place than it is just sort of spread around citywide. Secondly, the second kind of conclusion or observation we've drawn is that exclusion from some areas of the city contributes to displacement in others. And I think this is the big message that I took away from looking at the community planning program and how far we got and when we stopped and what we left still on the table. Zoning changes are needed as a basic way to mitigate growing household cost burdens. Supply of housing absolutely matters. It also matters to do it in more places so that we can create economically accessible, high-opportunity neighborhoods. So zoning, or the ability to build housing, delivers that. But zoning changes are not enough, and they're not enough, as we've seen, to undo the historical disparities either. Finally, what would need to accompany this? If we want to pursue equitable community development, there's some lessons that we already are implementing in the work that we're doing with PHB and the Housing Bureau in Prosper Portland. Partner with communities and those impacted by displacement on these strategies. So the voices of those most impacted are at the table. Cross-bureau strategies, because while an investment in a park or in a needed transportation improvement may be associated with displacement, it is not the tool to undo displacement, so it takes a multi-bureau effort. I think we're seeing the need to finish addressing old zoning patterns that have created barriers to equitable citywide outcomes. And we also need to get those that benefited the most from past policy to join us in this work. So that's our report back to you on what we've learned from looking at the past zoning policies and development policies in the city. So thank you.
Commissioner Gadeli's been the only one that could hold us off.
Before you go, Commissioner, could I just note that we haven't mentioned Native people at all, and that the zoning policies date back to when the settlers took the Native people's land, and then perpetuated as to who could then have those settlement places and then how you could subdivide those settlement places. So that is something that I think we also need to be addressing and making sure that when we are talking about impacted communities, we're especially considering Native people.
I would add the Asian Pacific Islander community to that list as well.
Oh, you do
I'm sorry. It
Sorry, I was
not.
confused.
No.
Good. I thought it was a great report. It's provocative.
Commissioner Udaley was about to speak.
That's
Sorry,
all right.
didn't see you.
That's
Go
all
for it.
right. Okay, so before I launch into my critique, I just want to acknowledge that this is an important moment. We are kind of laying bare for everyone to see who is paying attention to this work session, but hopefully there'll be follow-up in the media. The underpinnings of our planning, racist underpinnings of our planning and zoning laws and how they continue to reverberate today. And it's something that communities are reckoning with or really need to reckon with across the country. So I want to thank you for that and thank you, Mayor. We didn't get here by accident. People don't filter themselves into neat, segregated categories. This is by design. This has happened by design. And I think someone touched on this, and I think it's really important to highlight this. Over 100 years ago, when the Supreme Court said it is not constitutional to exclude people from occupying or owning property based on race, the government colluded with industry to come up with public policy to do just that. And we still are living with that legacy. So now for what I actually wrote down. And I wrote it down before you were done, so I think you deserve a couple extra points than what I'm giving right here. I want to appreciate the acknowledgement of our racist underpinnings of our planning and zoning. Social engineering through racist public policy has been endemic to our country since its origins, but acknowledging it is not enough. And changing the zoning laws, laws that should have never existed to begin with, is also not enough. We have to offer remedies to the communities who have been most negatively impacted by these laws. And we have to ensure we're not doing further harm. And that is my biggest fear, and I think that's what you're hearing from most of us sitting up here. To me, that means we have to have meaningful anti-displacement measures in place when we pass RIP, not sometime down the line. I'm going to go over a couple of my priorities. The first is tenant opportunity to purchase, sometimes referred to as intent to sell. It is a top demand from Anti-Displacement PDX, which is a coalition of community organizations that compelled the city to integrate numerous anti-displacement measures into our comp plan. And they continue to remind us that we did that, but without really figuring out how we would implement and enforce those measures. So since 2007, or in 2017, my office conducted research and began an internal advisory group that included members of Anti-Displacement PDX, community partners, the Housing Bureau, Prosper Portland, city attorneys, as well as property owners and real estate agents to build a framework for a policy that would require a property owner to give 90 days notice to the city and to tenants when they intended to sell their rental. The policy would give tenants a first right of refusal to purchase the property at full market value before it hit the open market. For buildings over 20 units, the city would be given the second right of refusal. Our intent with giving that second right of refusal was to allow the city an opportunity to purchase larger multifamily developments using our housing bond dollars. However, those dollars are mostly allocated, so that piece of the policy may or may not be necessary. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or TOPA, was first passed in Washington DC in 1979 and has contributed to the anti-displacement of many tenants living in naturally occurring affordable housing units. Of course, this policy will not be meaningful unless we are able to deliver loan products to these renters who are likely to be lower income and less likely to be ready to buy a home. And so that's another piece of the puzzle. We've provided copies of the framework to the mayor's office, and we're more than happy to work with everyone's offices to turn that framework into a more refined policy that we could pass at the same time as the final vote on RIP in the spring. The second initiative is not as obviously related, I think, as TOPA, but I think would be a powerful tool for anti-displacement, as well as helping moderate income homeowners build wealth in their property, age in place, and help contribute much needed housing units to the city. And that is a loan product for ADU development. Right now, there's a gap in the market because this type of development has been largely prohibited by our racist zoning laws, but as that changes, there's going to be a need, and I'm just going to boil these points down. Currently, average homeowners, and I'd say most homeowners don't have access to the capital they would need to construct an ADU, whether that's a basement ADU, attached or detached ADU. My concern is that the only way for those homeowners to realize the increased value or potential in their property is to sell it to a developer who is more likely to tear down the entire home and replace it with less affordable units. My office has been working with Craft 3, BPS, and other community partners for the last 3 years to refine a loan product that would make development loans far more accessible to average homeowners by simply taking into account the revenue that would be generated by that ADU. That's something that we allow commercial landlords are able to do, but individual homeowners are not. I am pleased and somewhat chagrined to share with you that about 1.5 years ago, I met with one of my council colleagues in Seattle at a conference and shared this plan with her, and Seattle recently passed a $2 million commitment to an ADU loan program. My only consolation is that we are actually much further along in developing this product than Seattle. So if we were to obtain that funding, we could still beat them. And I like to think of myself as not a very competitive person, but for some reason when it comes to Seattle, it just brings the worst out of me. So we have untapped potential throughout the whole city of individual property owners who want to help in our housing crisis. They want to build ADUs. They want to provide housing. They may want to move into that ADU now that their kids are gone, or they may be single and retired and rent that full-sized home out to a family who needs it. And that aspiration is largely out of reach for most Portland homeowners. So my request, once again, and I've been asking for this for 3 years, is a budget allocation that would be used as seed money to bring the loan product to the market. The amount is negotiable. It keeps going down as we get more and more work done with the financial institutions we've been working with and community. But I'm very eager to see it through and hopeful we can find some funds. And finally, I am largely supportive of RIP. I love the work that your Bureau has done, but I cannot support it unless we have meaningful, strong anti-displacement measures in place at the time of the vote.
So I want to add my appreciation, even if it didn't sound like I was appreciating the work that you've done. I want you to know I am greatly appreciative of your directness when it came to gathering this information, publicizing it, and then talking about it and sharing it so that it's on your website and the public has access to it. So I'm greatly appreciative of that. Having said that, I'm still very concerned that even today, on today's city council agenda, there was an item to talk about developing a public-private partnership with 32 acres out in my neighborhood in East Portland. And I can't help but think, well, why aren't we trying to figure out how we undo the harm that we've done to communities of color when we talk about public-private partnerships with Prosper Portland? Prosper Portland has not been a good partner in communities of color. And so I'm just using that as an example because I just happened to see that was on this morning's agenda. But so I guess my question specifically is, why are we not using race-specific remedies to solve the racial harm that's been done based on the city of Portland practices and policies since its beginning? Why can we not have racially specific responses to this? Anybody?
Commissioner, I'm sort of an expert in the tools that we have, so I'm not sure I have an answer to your question.
Well, I mean, I think about the right to return policy
Right.
that happens in inner Northeast, right? But it is a race-neutral policy. We clearly can make the case that the city of Portland and the state of Oregon has had discriminatory policies in place since its inception, and they have had a detrimental impact on specific communities over and over and over again. Yet when we develop policies that are supposed to undo the harm, we say they have to be race neutral. And I'm just trying to figure out how can we have this history and then say, but we can't actually talk, we can't do a race specific remedy because that would be illegal. But this isn't illegal, right?
So yes, I think the solutions that we advance have to be in alignment with what's legally allowed. I do think that the way that we approach it is to apply kind of an analysis of look at who's most at risk, who's been most harmed, who's most vulnerable, which then allows us to lead to kind of tailored action. And that will likely be racially informed,
But let me challenge you on that, right? There used to be 2 African American majority census tracts in inner Northeast Portland, at least 2. That disappeared in 2000, and it disappeared because redistricting legislators felt it more important to have a majority than they did to maintain a majority African American district, right? And so what you're telling me is not going to have an impact on those 10,000 black households who've now been dispersed all over to who knows where, or the ones who've just been displaced over the last decade based on our current policy, right? So anything you tell me now, how is that going to actually undo the harm that's actually been done in the city? And again, I feel bad that I'm asking you these hard questions, but you're here, so I gotta ask you. If I don't ask you, who else am I gonna ask?
And these are some of the questions, these are important questions to pose because these are some of the questions that our citywide anti-displacement group really need to grapple with, right? And I think we want to make sure that as we make recommendations and commitments that we can actually follow through on them too, that we're not over-promising as well. And so I think that's the work that we will be doing with this citywide team, with housing, with Office of Equity and Human Rights, with PBOT, with Prosper, is really to hone in on what are the strategies, what are the action plans, how do we apply this commitment and make it real and make sure that we're translating this commitment that we're hearing into some action. And I think being focused on that. So we still are in that process, and I can't tell you how it's translating yet, but that's the work that we are doing, and we will certainly bring that back. And we're doing work around the budget process, and we'll be bringing back some recommendations around the budget process next year, and we'll be looking for your feedback and prioritization in that effort.
Commissioner, if I could add to the answer before we move on to this idea, for the specific sort of policy decisions we're bringing forward in Housing Opportunity Initiative, one of the lessons from this, but it's sort of a practice, is don't have the success, the benefits that whatever you're going to do bring, have those depend on an allocation of resources or a program you don't have, right? So that's a problem. That's an approach you're going to see right through and call us on, and that's part of the discourse we've been having. I think if we look at what we're about to talk about in the housing opportunity analysis, it's really different than the Albina story, but it's similar in this way. Remember, our success and where these zoning tools that we put on the table are used, given that it is driven by the market and or whatever investments we make in affordable housing and the like. In Albina, that market was twisted and stacked against a whole community. So to the extent that we're looking at the rest of the city or, outside of a world where that's still rigidly the case, institutionally it is, they're not apples to oranges comparing situations. Increasing, and I think that lesson from the second bunch of our conclusions, that exclusion from some neighborhoods, why is part of what causes displacement pressures in others. The housing in East Portland, in its valuation, in its rise, is driven by the lack of choices elsewhere in part too. And so there's something foundational that we left undone when we stopped doing those community area plans. And remember, that zoning that was at the same track as segregationist zoning or policies were taking place for Albina. The other one, and it's not inherently this way, but we were protecting neighborhoods. And so,
Look like me, right?
what, for a variety of reasons. And when that reason, that particularly the clear racist reason, that maybe have been long forgotten, but we're leaving well-located, high-opportunity neighborhoods that could have more housing on the table. And that's driving people to East Portland, and that's driving up housing prices. So there is a supply side part of this that isn't necessarily the Albina story, because we're not concentrating it all in a neighborhood that we've already had decades worth of disinvestment for, and knowing we're not showing up with the anti-displacement dollars to make it work. It's different because we're spreading it around. This is more like the foundation. And over the next few months when we're going through RIP, I hope to be able to make that clear. I apologize for that.
And I want to be clear, I support RIP because I do think that people are entitled to live in any neighborhood they want to live in, and their income should not determine what neighborhood they live in. So I want to be real clear about that. But my fear is that the horse has already left the barn, right? We already have big developers out in East Portland who have big blocks of land that they're going to develop these public-private partnerships with that they will benefit from, and the folks who currently today live in East Portland will not benefit from. What we are calling naturally affordable housing is really crappy housing that people are paying way too much money for. And so I in no way want to protect crappy housing that people would love to get out of, because it is crappy, but they can't afford to move somewhere else. That is what we have now in East Portland, and already they're developing all these big apartment complexes that will start displacing folks long before your committee is up and running and making any decisions at all. So that's my fear. It's like, what's going to stop people from just doing it now?
Commissioner, I share that concern. I do encourage you to watch the tape from this morning of the Time Certain about the Gateway development that pretty much had Commissioner Daly and me almost in tears, that they are doing such a good job of making sure that the people who live there now are going to benefit. So it wasn't all that long of a presentation. It was really, really good. And I really appreciate that you're starting this conversation leading with race. I think it's a very important conversation, one that we would not have had 10 years ago. And thank you. You're giving some very important personal and historical perspective, Commissioner Hardesty. So let me ask a hard question, and that is, why are we considering the residential infill projects when all of the people of colour and the East Portland representative on the Planning Commission voted against it?
Right, so that's actually a good opportunity to shift into residential infill.
Right after our break.
But let's break first, because we'll have some other panels that we can invite. And Chair Schultz from the commission will be here, and she can address that directly.
Unless you had other questions?
No, I was just hoping for an answer for that one.
We will answer that. Chair Schultz will be here, and she'll be able to answer
Why don't we
that.
do that? Because why don't we take a break? Are we done with? Okay, first of all,
Yes.
I just want to thank you for the report. I thought the report was excellent, and you heard lots of other aspects related to history, related to urban planning, related to urban development that was not necessarily part of your report, but are really important elements of this larger story of displacement. But the part that you focused on, the zoning part, was critically important, and I thought you did a great job. And I learned a lot from it, and it's provoked a good conversation, and I appreciate it. So thank you for that. We are going to adjourn for what, how much time would you like? 10 minutes? Good. So let's try to be back here, please. It looks like at about 10 minutes on the large, oversized novelty clock in the back of the
55.
room. Thank you. ahead and get started, and the attorney worked something out for me, which I appreciate, so I'm going to read. Before we begin the residential infill project work session, I want to announce that I own property in a residential zone. Properties in all residential zones could be impacted by the residential infill project. I have no plans and no intent to redevelop or change the use of my property. However, out of an abundance of caution, I am disclosing this as a potential conflict of interest.
And I make the same statement, Commissioner, while you were out, this also applies to renters, that you have to say that you rent in the affected area and it may affect you.
Oh, all righty. Well, let me just say, I don't own any property, but I do rent in an area that may be impacted by the residential infill project, and therefore, I may have a conflict of interest. My goodness, won't we all, if we live in the city of Portland?
It's really kind of a problem. It's a case out of Springfield. And if we have actual conflicts of interest, which we may,
Right.
We can all vote, but we can't discuss it at all.
Wow. That makes perfect sense. Thank you for that.
Oh, you have to declare that you're a renter and that you may be affected by these regulations. We've all done.
Yeah, we've all.
We're all
I
affected.
had a fancy pants script. You want to see it? You don't have
Thanks,
to do it
everybody.
now. Just take a look at it, and then
He had to be special.
I had to be
Nice
special.
long one.
Yeah.
Oh, so you guys are serious. All right. I want to. Sorry. It's what I get for being late to the party. So I want to announce that I do not own property in a residential zone, but I do rent in a residential zone. And properties in all residential zones could be impacted by the residential infill project, but not my property because it's on the National Historic Registry.
There you go. So we're back at Portland
Right.
City Council live, improv. Take it away, residential infill.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. We are now shifting to the work session for residential infill. The residential infill project, which you will hear about more shortly, is one of the first BPS projects that sought to better understand that the harm, the racial history that we heard about earlier, and how we might prevent it through policies. And it specifically addresses the exclusivity of single-family zone neighborhoods. As part of RIP, we conducted a displacement analysis. By measuring the impacts of zoning decisions on displacement of our most vulnerable communities, we can plan to mitigate that harm. We're proud to be among the first in the country to establish a practice of displacement analysis in doing this important work. And RIP was our first project to measure this impact, and BPS staff are continuing to develop the tools to address it. We're moving to slide 2. But what we know is that we can't solve Portland's housing crisis or prevent unintended racist outcomes with zoning alone, as we've mentioned. I'm pleased to share that there are multiple ways that the city is working to grow and equitably meet the housing needs of residents. These include funding and programs related to affordable housing production, assistance to households facing housing insecurity, renters, low-income households, and the houseless, targeted programs for communities of color who are most impacted by these changes and the past history of public policy, including zoning, and public policies around building code and zonings, which we'll talk about. Slide 3. Rewriting the code. So as part of the Housing Opportunities Initiative, we've been working on 2 zoning projects that complete the work started with the Mixed-Use Zones project. City Council's work on Better Housing by Design, rewriting our approach to multi-dwelling zones, is nearly complete. Today, we begin the discussions about the largest piece of Portland's housing zones, reworking of Portland's single-family dwellings. This will build up our middle housing stock so we can create more housing in our community that our communities can afford to live in and be near core services. And while we increase housing opportunities to address our city's long-term housing needs, which is an anti-displacement strategy, we also know that we must do more to implement additional strategies and tools that keep people in place if they're at risk. Community and civic leaders, including our Planning and Sustainability Commission and City Council, you've raised these concerns, we've just heard them, about displacement of low-income households when new development occurs. This is an important part of the conversation and a very active part of the deliberations in terms of our action plans. So let me just kind of walk through the agenda for today. Slide 4. I'm going to turn it here shortly to our chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. We'll have, I'll invite 4 guest speakers to share their perspectives, and then I'm going to shift to our staff, Sandra and Morgan, who will walk through our specific recommendations for residential infill. So with that, I'll introduce Chair Catherine Schultz, the chair of the PSC.
Hello. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. My name's Kat Schultz. I'm the chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. Thanks for having me back at City Council to share our commission's recommendation on this important project. Before I dive into my comments, Commissioner Udaley, with regards to your loan program, just a reminder that imitation is the strongest form of flattery, so they say.
I got to give them something to imitate.
The residential infill project makes important fundamental changes needed to meet Portland's housing goals and needs. It positions Portland as an inclusive, welcoming city for all, and we're honored to be a part of the process. The PSC's letter of recommendation to City Council describes our support for the residential infill project's ability to improve housing choice and diversity. I'm going to let staff provide you with the details of what's included in that recommendation. Our letter also describes many items that we discussed, that we heard in testimony, and perhaps more importantly, felt passionately about, but we're beyond the scope of this project, so I'll let that letter speak to those issues. Today, I just want to focus on 2 items that I think will help you in your work and your deliberations. Those are project goals and our thinking about displacement at the conclusion of our work, which follows much of the thinking that you folks just expressed in the racist history session. And Commissioner Hardesty, I wanted to note for you that while it's a small step, the conversations that we had do reflect a change in our deliberations since the comp plan policies have been enacted. So it's a small, minor step, but we felt proud of that step. So starting with goals, as we began our work, we had a robust discussion to frame what success looks like for this project. This discussion was grounded in the many goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. Establishing this common foundation of goals was invaluable in guiding us towards a cohesive amendment package. The slide that's up at the moment outlines many of the goals that we kept in mind during our deliberations as we crafted this package. Those include equitable benefits and cost, more housing options, and less expensive housing options. It's important to note that the entire PSC expressed support for residential infill projects' ability to improve housing choice and housing diversity. With regards to displacement, based on the analysis of this proposal, overall displacement will be significantly reduced across the city by 28%. There are 3 neighborhoods where that's not the case, and while the PSC shared concerns about the potential displacement impact for these changes, in the end, the Commission's final vote was 5-4 in support of the proposal. Those members who voted against the proposal made it clear that they did so out of concern for displacement. As a matter of fact, all PSC commissioners expressed concern that Portland's current programs and funding are insufficient to protect low-income and minority renters and homeowners from existing displacement pressures. The PSC did agree that the residential infill project contains provisions that reduce displacement by limiting the size of new homes, creating less expensive housing options, by providing new options for building around or internally dividing existing homes rather than tearing them down, and by permitting multiple homes to be built where only one is currently allowed. The analysis showed that these provisions would reduce displacement risk citywide compared to the current zoning. This includes less displacement in neighborhoods such as Cully or parts of East Portland that have high risk of displacement today. However, the risk is increased in a few areas which could see more infill under the new code because land values and rents in these neighborhoods will tend to attract more development under the proposal than the current zoning. PSC members who voted against the proposal felt that the impact to low-income and minority households is not acceptable. Some expressed concern that this could become a repeat of the displacement of the African-American community seen in inner Northeast Portland. Some expressed concern that, like the current zoning, this proposal is unlikely to directly increase the supply of housing affordable to low-income households displaced by single-family homes. And some expressed concern about the impact on East Portland since the area has larger lots, lower land cost, and the potential to attract large share of new infill development. These commissioners recommended delaying the implementation in parts of the city where redevelopment pressure overlaps with high concentrations of low-income and minority households until resource programs are put in place. In the end, the majority of the commissioners felt that on balance, the benefits allowing for greater access to housing options in all of Portland's neighborhoods by allowing more units at lower prices warranted advancing the proposal to City Council. Commissioner Fritz, to address your question, why did we vote this proposal forward? It's because we believe the proposal makes sense, these changes need to be made, and we are concerned about displacement, but we were not the body or the commission to make the changes that need to be made on the programs and support that need to come along with it. You are. In conclusion, we recommend that the residential infill project for adoption by City Council because it plays a key role in meeting our housing supply access and equity goals. At the same time, our recommendation highlights the critical importance of crafting strong anti-displacement programs that accompany implementation. The programs that are needed to mitigate the potential impacts from existing and new city regulations and investments on Portlanders with the fewest housing choices. I'll be here for the entire work session today, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have throughout as staff runs through their presentation. And last but not least, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we spent a lot of time thinking about this project, and we're happy to assist you in any way as you move forward with your work. Thank you.
Thank you. And did you email us a copy of your testimony? You probably did.
I certainly can,
Would you mind?
because
That'd
I
be
made some
helpful.
changes on the fly.
That'd
so I
be
will do
great.
that.
Yeah, it's no urgency, but if in the next several days, if
Of
you could
course.
get it to us, I'd appreciate it.
course.
Thank you.
So thank you, Madam Chair. My question was not exactly why did you vote it forward? You've explained that. It's the question of why did all of the people of colour and the East Portland representative vote against it? And now my further question is, doesn't that give you cause for concern? I'm haunted by Gretchen Kafori saying in some of the last years of her life about the Albina plan, oh my God, we thought we were doing the right thing. And I'm just mindful that here we are, the white people, speaking for myself, and now all the white people on the Planning Commission are saying, we know better. So talk to me about that, please.
It's a fair question. I think, in general, those who voted for the proposal felt it did more good, and were hopeful in you folks in putting together the programs that are needed to go along with it, and that with those coming together, it addressed the concerns that the commissioners who voted against it had. So I agree. It doesn't answer your question specifically, but
So since you passed this forward, House Bill 2001 has passed, and we have until June of 2022 to put something like this in place. With that in mind, would the Commission entertain a further discussion of what those anti-displacement measures should be that we could put in place before we move forward with this project?
I think we would be honored to participate with you in discussing what ideas we would have regarding programs.
Thank you.
Let's talk about East Portland for a minute, because wasn't the original plan to exempt East Portland from RIP? And of course, concerns were raised that we were denying kind of opportunity across the board. You've said that some areas of East Portland would see less displacement than with current zoning, and some would see more. Why can't we be a little more nuanced instead of just exempting the entire district, then protecting those areas we're most concerned about until we have these more well-thought-out anti-displacement strategies?
I think it's a great deliberation for you folks to have.
Yeah.
We went a lot back and forth on that quite a bit. For those who moved this forward to you, the concern was perhaps not fully understanding if you parsed it out. We didn't have the analysis to understand if that then made things, if it had a ripple effect and made things worse elsewhere. So I would highly recommend that you push to have that analysis done if that's what you're going to do. We felt like that might be an idea, but we had no background or data to support what it meant.
Yeah. And, I mean, I'd be reluctant to wait till 2022 simply because we know that our current zoning is highly problematic and is still driving displacement. We're in year 10 of a housing crisis. We need more units, and we need more little a, we need both, more affordable in general units that would come with some of these, townhouses or fourplexes, to take some pressure off of the market. But yeah, I'm also a little nervous about unintended consequences.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you being here today. On the same note, I was going to take it at a different tack. Would it be legal for us to exempt certain areas of the city or delay implementation in certain areas of the city rather than like a blanket, anything goes all over the city of Portland?
I'm not an attorney, but I believe so because we considered that. And it came to us that way. So I believe, like I said, I don't believe there's any issues with that. Like, again, our concern was more just, and then I would encourage you to have the analysis done to make sure that you haven't, by doing that, actually increased displacement elsewhere. Right. That's what kind of on that on balance throughout the whole city that we just didn't have the information about.
And Madam Chairwoman, when you say affordable housing, what do you mean when you say affordable housing?
I would say more affordable, not truly affordable housing.
And affordable for who?
For it's at, I would say 100% MFI and above, right? It's not
say that again?
affordable for 80% MFI or not affordable for 60% MFI. We did not ever believe that this was going to produce truly affordable housing. It was, I would say, the parsing of the words would be more affordable.
I appreciate you saying that, yes, because it was never sold to me that this was going to produce affordable housing. But when when the document says affordable housing, affordable rents, that made me like go, oh, is there? What do you mean? And for who? Who? Right? Who's it affordable for? I guess my last question is. Do you have any recommendations on anti-displacement that came out of the deliberations of your committee that you have not heard us discuss here? I think you've heard our concern is that by the time we do our anti-displacement work, it'll be for some other generation that isn't born yet, right? Because it would already have happened. Whatever was going to happen would have already happened.
Yes. I would say our committee itself didn't come up with it, but a lot came through our testimony. Staff has access to that, and I think we felt that a lot of those programs made a lot of sense, and we're supportive of them. So again, we'll have to work to pull those together for you.
And last but not least, I want to go back to Commissioner Fritz's question because I kind of felt like you hemmed and hawed around her question. If all the people of color voted in opposition to it and the people who live in the community that's going to be most impacted voted against it, and what I heard you say was, but the majority of white people on the committee thought this was going to be best overall, right? And so the Albina Community Plan, there were people that thought that was going to be best overall, even if a few people were inconvenienced by it. And so I do want to go back to that question and go, was there something else that the committee could have recommended rather than this 5-4 vote? Because I felt like you just kind of kicked the ball to us rather than actually making a definitive decision. My
Fair.
personal opinion, I didn't ask my colleagues, but that's how I felt when I was like, why did give us a 5-4 decision? That sounds like my name is Bennett and I don't want to be the one responsible. So I'll just give it to you and you do what you need to do.
It's a fair question. So we didn't take a poll of commissioners in advance of the actual vote. So I can't say that I knew going into the moment we took that vote where all of my fellow commissioners were going to land on the decision. There was a lot of back and forth. Honestly, right before we kind of came towards the end of our deliberations was most most in-depth discussions about displacement. And because it came out right towards the end. I think we were kind of still dealing with getting that information, that analysis, and what it meant. And I honestly can say I was surprised by the vote at the end of the day. I didn't think we were going to see a vote that was as close as it was. So I didn't have the chance or the opportunity to, or we as a committee didn't have the chance or the opportunity to come to a stronger consensus for you. Or recommendation. It was a surprise, I'll be honest. I do think, without a doubt, the deliberations will go back to what I've already said and point to our concern about not having the information kind of at that last minute about displacement and how to look at refining the recommendation. So to the point that how to be more targeted and if that would affect our vote or our change. Should we have held up the work and not passed it to you and asked for the information to be given at that time to then pass a recommendation on? Perhaps, and perhaps we should own that. I think really we did feel that it was work that staff could continue to do, and that in general, since everybody was supporting all but the displacement, that was the continuing work that needed to happen and come to you folks. And just wanted to be clear about our concerns, which is what we made sure we addressed.
Well,
It's not a great answer to you.
Not a great answer, but I appreciate you anticipating my last question, which you just answered. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Could I ask you a couple of questions?
course.
And first of all, I want to thank you. You delivered more than you got paid for, let's just put it this way. And these are really challenging issues, and I felt that the conversations you had were really forthright and honest, and it would have been great if you'd sent us a unanimous recommendation, but it also would have been surprising and maybe even not an accurate reflection of the complexity of this issue. So I really appreciate the work that was done. I just want to make sure I understand a couple of things you said, just so I can accurately reflect it and think upon it. Did you say that the overall displacement was reduced 28%? Did I hear you correctly? So the conundrum you're in, let me see if I can say it and then tell me, did I get it right or did I get it wrong? The conundrum here is that residential infill on its totality, you're taking the displacement out of the equation for a moment in specific neighborhoods, but on the totality, it does what you hoped it would do. Gives you a diversity of housing, diversity of affordability options, and overall it reduces displacement. But the displacement that there is highly concentrated in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. Is that an accurate interpretation of what you found?
Yes.
Okay, and there were the three neighborhoods that we've discussed here previously that were particularly impacted. Would it be fair to say, based on what you said earlier, it sounds like everybody liked residential infill, but when it got to the displacement in those predominantly three neighborhoods, but in those three areas, that was the deal breaker for those who dissented? Is that a fair statement?
I wouldn't say all 4 of the votes who dissented would agree with that statement. But I would guess the majority would.
Okay. And so if we were able to find ways to mitigate the displacement in those areas that the study shows displacement would be highly concentrated in, would those individuals likely to be supportive of the overall plan, or do you know?
I can only guess that you would have seen a vote that was 8-1.
Okay, and if we were to find displacement strategies that were both viable, workable, well, I'll add more than both, viable, workable, affordable, and legal, presumably we could send it back and you could all have a discussion and get a sense at least of the room, if not a formal process, in terms of what you feel based on the work that we could potentially do either here or with partners or through the bureaus.
Absolutely. The Planning Commission, I think, would welcome the opportunity to deliberate on it again. It was
Okay.
it was a hefty topic for us, with the exception that some of those individuals that voted against the project are no longer on the commission, so we're not going to get their
Well,
points of view.
but the sensibility, one would presume, is still there. And we are, of course, under a deadline. There's now a clock ticking. And we have an obligation to fulfill state law, which as Commissioner Fritz has indicated is what, 2022?
Well, there are 2 clocks ticking. There's a skinny lots ticking, which.
Yeah, thank you.
But then there's the longer ticking is not until 2022.
Okay, so, and I'll just put my cards on the table. I'm fundamentally very strongly supportive of residential infill. But I share the concerns that have been expressed about the concentration of displacement in communities of color and lower income communities. And where I sit today, I have no clear idea of where we are going to land in terms of addressing those strategies. And Commissioner Udaley put forward a package in the budget process that we all rallied around and supported. And we've asked our bureaus to think creatively and thoughtfully about how to address displacement. If we can come up with ways to overcome it, it sounds like you were saying we could get to yes on residential infill.
I believe so.
Okay.
Could I just clarify a
Please.
question? When talking about displacement, are we talking about a class of people or the individual people? Was it looked at is that person's home going to be demolished? Or is it going to, or was it more, will there be more relatively affordable housing because of this project?
It's an excellent question. So for some individuals, when we discussed this project, one person being displaced would have meant they voted against it. One person. So, I mean, just
I'm
keep that
sorry,
in mind.
could you say that again?
For one of the individuals who voted against this project, if even one person was displaced, they couldn't support this project. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? So
Right.
it wasn't a class, it wasn't a group, I mean, it was just.
But
that-
we're talking about whether it's demolition or whether it's repurposing. Because part of the thought was that you wouldn't be displacing because the person would still be able to stay in the home, but there'd be two other families living in the home as well.
So we had some of that discussion. We had some of the discussion that if a home got demolished and multiple units got put in its place, that it allowed the opportunities for some families to stay within their neighborhoods.
But they
Am I
wouldn't
getting
be,
that?
because they wouldn't be the same family. They've got to find somewhere else. So the example I just gave Commissioner Hardesty this morning, which was in Gateway, there was a development company, a property management company, that for the people who are going to be displaced by the project, they're offering them to go to one of the apartments, the other apartments that are owned by the property manager. That was one of their choices, and they would pay for the moving costs. They were going to be offered they could move somewhere else and they would be assisted, or they could be assisted with a down payment on a purchase. So, but that's not going to happen for the people who are going to get evicted from a home that's going to be demolished. They'll get Commissioner Udaley's relocation expenses, and that's it. Right?
You are correct, and that's some of the concern of not having programs in place to support those individuals.
So I want to be a little careful, because now we're getting into the question of what are we talking about when we're talking about displacement? Because I agree
Yeah.
with you, the conversation this morning was good, but they had a very narrow and specific definition of what displacement meant with regard to that project. My understanding was the conversation you all had about displacement was a broader definition of displacement, including long-term displacement. Am I wrong about that? What were you guys
I would say we
talking
talked about both, and we're also
Because
struggling
when
on
we
defining it.
build a park in a neighborhood, we probably cause some people to be displaced, because when you build a park, the value of
Yep.
things around that park increase. I mean, so over the long term, we are probably displacing some people. So it makes me a little nervous when I hear somebody says if even one person is displaced, that's too many. I mean, so I think we have to be a little bit careful about what our definition and how broad that definition becomes. Because ultimately, any public investment could potentially lead to some level of displacement. So the question for me is, can we come to an agreement on what we're talking about? And for me, it's the immediate impact of displacement. And maybe we need to be more thoughtful about it.
You're absolutely right. We struggled with exactly what this conversation is right here.
Okay.
And I think, which is a part of why we're asking for the work that you guys have now funded, the study, to help the thinking about what is the city's goals with regard to displacement, and what are we saying when we talk about displacement, and allowing us to use that toolkit to be able to do our work, to have, I think, a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve.
So let's ask the experts. What do you guys think? I mean, it's a great conversation. I'm really glad we're having it. How would you help the city council
Could I
draw?
jump?
Yeah, Commissioner.
Because I
Sure.
have yet another question about this same issue, and I hate to pile on, but I really need to understand what kind of analysis was done in order to know whether I care about the numbers you're giving me or not. So if the committee was simply charged with looking at, we have X number of people with current zoning, we have X number of units. With the RIP, we will be able to build X number more. Therefore, we will see, whatever you said, 26% less displacement. If there's no deeper analysis of the impact on households by income, that's what I'm worried about. Because as someone, I think it's been mentioned, someone currently living in a, let's say, rental home that is affordable to them, if that rental home is torn down and replaced by 4 homes, then yes, technically, we have housing for 4 times as many households, but that household is, the cost of that, of those units are likely to be much higher than the original home, and therefore that family that's currently there would be displaced. And thanks for mentioning relocation, because, I mean, that is one anti-displacement measure we've taken to stabilize people in their existing housing and give them some kind of a fighting chance of being able to afford relocating. But I'm really worried about what this might look like on a mass level.
So this is great, because this gets to the conversation you and I had 6 weeks ago. Because Commissioner Daly is right, that in the near term, that would be a displacement. But over the long term, it's creating more housing affordability in that neighborhood, isn't it?
Yes, and if you get a
So
second, I'll give it a shot.
There's a generational question here.
But if I,
It's not for the people who are displaced.
Exactly,
Well,
and
no,
not necessarily more affordable.
so, when you think about the residential infill, the resident that was sort of our target for how do we solve the impact on this person is a low-income renter of a single-family house. And ideally, even more priority is a low-income renter of a single-family house, and the renter is a person of color. Like, that's the person we wanted to make sure we didn't impact, or wanted to understand how it was if we impacted them. Because outside of that individual's impact, having something that resulted in less demolition of single-family houses, because remember, we're making the houses smaller, that gives stability. So that renter, who is the low-income renter in that house, isn't facing any pressure to be kicked out of that house because it's a duplex. They may face pressure, and this is the thing that we can't forget, because somebody with more money is going to buy that house. And so, but it won't be because of the duplex. Rental relocation, the kind of protections that Commissioner Udaley was advocating, is the most direct thing we could think of doing, and that's not a zoning tool. Because between better housing by design, and it goes, the thing that's like it, Commissioner Hardesty, is the naturally occurring affordable housing versus more multifamily housing that's better housing that comes from better housing by design, right? Just because we don't have a way to do what they're doing in the Gateway program to protect those individuals in the natural occurring, do we not build more multifamily housing? Because housing supply is critical to keeping price down. So RIP is in that same spirit. It increases this, every time you tear down a house, it makes it more likely you're going to get 2 or 3 units. So in that same place, they may not be the same households because it isn't affordable. It's less expensive housing, but it's not affordable. But more households that could choose to try to land in an inner neighborhood in that unit, where their alternative would be to go rent a house in Lentz or rent a house in East Portland, because that's where the price of that might be. They're going to pay for the commute and all, and them taking more money out there and renting that house drives the price of that rent up in East Portland and rent. So increasing supply is just part of the solution. It doesn't handle the impact on the household that has to move, and that's, I think, kind of where we got stymied on the whole thing too. Does that make sense?
It makes
Mayor and
sense.
Commissioners, I'd like to suggest that we
Yes.
have invited testimony and guests, and I think their perspective will add to this conversation. So if we could shift to
I
that.
have one more question for Chair Schultz, if I
Okay.
may. So the 3 of you who were sharing the table here were not here when we adopted the comprehensive plan policies. And we had a lot of discussion about this over the course of 4 years, and indeed looking at the zoning on different parcels, lot by lot all over the city. Policy 5.6, middle housing, says enable and encourage development of middle housing. This includes multi-unit or clustered residential buildings that provide relatively smaller, less expensive units, more units, and a scale transition between the core of the mixed-use center and surrounding single-family areas. All right, that seems like all of this is good on that. Where appropriate, apply zoning that would allow this within a quarter mile of designated centres, corridors with frequent transit service, high-quality transit stations, and within the inner ring around the central city. So I'm really worried about the climate crisis. I am really worried about people driving and not being able to have transit, and we know that we don't have transit everywhere. Why did the Planning Commission decide to expand it beyond the quarter mile from these centres, these frequent transit centres, to pretty much everywhere?
We were supportive of housing choice in all, and options in all neighborhoods. We absolutely want to do exactly what you said and supported it. That's why we got Better Housing by Design. It's why we've done all the other work that we've been doing. But we also believe that expanding this to other neighborhoods is a good thing to be for the city.
Even if people can't have to drive, if there's no transit and no sidewalks?
Overall, I would say yes. It provides more options for more people throughout the entire city versus just saying that your only option is in a center or a corridor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In time check, 1 hour, and you've got invited guests.
Yes, we thank
Great.
you very much. So I'd like to invite Holly Balkan from the Portland Neighbors Welcome, Nicole Johnson from Thousand Friends of Oregon, Danny Ledesma from Portland Public Schools, and Rose Ojeda from Hacienda to join us. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon.
While they're coming up, Madam Chairman, thank you so much. That was a
you.
really good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you,
for
and I'm
being
going to stay up here throughout
Great.
your work session today.
Great, thank you.
You want to start, Danny?
Sure, thank you.
Oh, there is. I'm
Mayor,
sorry.
Commissioners, my name is Danny Ledesma. I'm with Portland Public Schools. I'm our Senior Advisor in Racial Equity and Social Justice. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and share our perspective on this important project that we think has a significant impact on education. And what we know in education is that housing matters to children and to children's education. And having a safe, affordable place to live is often what makes the difference for students to succeed in school. And so we know that our city is experiencing a significant housing crisis, and we know that building more housing is one part of the solution. But what we'd like to talk with you about is the impacts of where that housing is and how that impacts education. Today, the neighborhoods that surround most of the schools in PPS in our district are zoned almost exclusively for single-family homes. This exclusive zoning impacts which neighborhood school a family can afford to attend. It's important to remember that families of children in our district, they don't only live in single-family homes, they live in apartment buildings and duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, ADUs, and too many of our students, over 1,000, are struggling without a stable home. We often talk a lot in the city of Portland about the value of neighborhood schools. But one fact that we often leave out of the conversation or compartmentalize in the conversation is that the student populations of our schools are a direct reflection of the housing options that are available in the surrounding neighborhoods. And so as a result, access to those schools is limited by families' ability to afford a home. And we know that that limit is often racialized in our city. Exclusionary zoning leads to economic segregation of schools and, as a result, significant racial segregation. Why is the student population of one PPS school 14% white, and at another school 3 miles away is 79% white? One reason is because of exclusionary single-family zoning. Right now, single-family homes are the only housing option in most neighborhoods in Portland, and they are priced to be out of reach for all families, for families of color specifically. Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and ADUs can provide options that are more affordable than what's available in most Portland neighborhoods. So by preserving the single-family nature of these neighborhoods, we are essentially walling off access to our schools for a large portion of our student population, especially our students of color. There is ample research to show that student outcomes improve. They're not just impacted, but in fact are improved by a more balanced racial and economic integration. And any measures that support desegregation of housing will work hand in hand with what we want to accomplish with the Student Success Act and the legislation that was recently approved and our plans of how to utilize that funding to impact students of color. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about this and to also really say that I think that as our city, and we've been doing this for a while, as our city contends with the significant housing and community development education issues, I want to say that at Portland Public Schools, we're really emboldened and bolstered by your work, and that you're looking at this through a racial lens, and that we're not backing away from looking at the long-term racial segregation that's been in our city. But we also want to stand shoulder to shoulder with you as a public entity in saying that our solutions have to be racialized as well. And so we thank you for the work that you've been doing, and we look forward to continuing to partner because we believe in the power and the potential of our students of color. And if our families of color are supported through more housing options, we believe that we can continue to try to provide a education for our students as well. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the partnership, and thanks for the energy that you bring not only to this, but so many other things. You're everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, okay. So, dear Mayor Wheeler and City Council, my name is Nicole Johnson, and I'm the I'm the Community Engagement Manager for 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of our land use planning system. Since the beginning stages of the residential infill project, 1,000 Friends has been a key participant. 1,000 Friends participated in the city's residential infill program stakeholder advisory committee appointed in 2015. We've convened Portland for Everyone, which is a coalition advocating for abundant, affordable, and diverse housing options in every neighborhood. And we are an active member of the Anti-Displacement Coalition, which is focusing on ending displacement and mitigating the effects of gentrification and expanding affordable housing opportunities throughout Portland, especially for people of color, low-income people, renters, people with disability, and older adults. And so today, I'm excited to say that we are pleased with how much progress the residential infill project has made with the passing of House Bill 2001, which will require cities over 10,000 to allow for duplexes on residential lots that are zoned for single-family housing, and cities over 25,000 to allow for other middle housing choices in single-family areas. Portland is at the crux of an exciting and defining time to do right. You have already heard the mistakes of the past regarding intentional racist planning practices in the report already presented. And now it's time to take action to be a leader in creating housing opportunities for all Portlanders at all income levels. The ADPDX Coalition, Anti-Displacement Coalition, would like to thank Mayor Wheeler and Council for investing in the Anti-Displacement Action Plan with funding from the regular budget and the fall bump. We are excited for community groups to work with the city and staff to co-create a plan that we can all stand on. We also know that there is no one policy that is a silver bullet. It is important and necessary to have complementary policies to solve problems holistically. We see the city making good faith efforts to build trust, and we feel like this is the right direction. We feel it is important to have more housing options at all income levels in every neighborhood, especially where in the past, certain neighborhoods were exclusively reserved for wealthy and predominantly white people to live. Although an increase of housing stock is heading in the right direction, we cannot rely on more units to reduce the housing cost alone. The Anti-Displacement Coalition partners are developing amendments to help ensure that many of the new homes developed through the residential infill project will actually be affordable and accessible to people of color and low-income Portlanders. Our initial proposed amendments go as follows. Strengthen the affordable housing density bonus to allow for developers to build more units in exchange for a guarantee that a portion of those units will be affordable long-term. And second, create a funding source to help affordable housing developers take advantage of the zoning changes by acquiring and developing infill housing in Portland single-dwelling zones. We are eager to work with members of the City Council to further develop these concepts so that they can be considered as amendments to the residential infill project proposal. We feel these concepts are essential in order for this zoning change to produce not only more homes, but more homes that are truly affordable to Portlanders who are otherwise priced out and excluded from so many of our neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I just want to say that was all over again. That was so good. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for inviting me here to testify. My name is Holly Balcom, and I'm here representing Portland Neighbors Welcome. We're a grassroots group dedicated to ensuring an abundant supply of homes so that every present and future Portlander can find a safe, stable home that they can afford. When I moved to Portland 10 years ago, I had the privilege to be able to choose to live anywhere in the city or in the suburbs. And like most Portlanders, I deeply care about the impact of my auto usage on the environment. So I rented and later bought a house in inner Northeast Portland where I walk to work and my son bicycles to school. And as the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability report shows, my range of choices on where to live was expanded by over a century of land use decisions that privilege people like me at the expense of non-white Portlanders. The distance between this outcome and the progressive values that drew me to Portland is why I co-founded Portland Neighbors Welcome to support more housing options in every neighborhood for everyone who wants to call our city home. Given what we know about the connection between auto pollution and poor health outcomes for pregnant women and children, the 1962 status quo of richer, whiter people driving their pollution through the middle of historically black neighborhoods was not acceptable. The current status quo in which marginalized communities are forced out of the city into long, expensive commutes is likewise not acceptable. The only solution that upholds the 2035 comprehensive plan and continues Portland's work to repair the damage done by racist planning is to finally make room for all of our neighbors in all of our neighborhoods. That's why Portland Neighbors Welcome is here to voice support of the proposed residential infill project. Although the city's experts have calculated that the current proposal reduces citywide displacement somewhat for communities of color, it's an incomplete solution. The project should be implemented alongside additional displacement and tenant protections for our most vulnerable renters, wherever they live. We must prioritize stability for tenants to give people the chance to rebuild the communities that were destroyed by past city policies. The original Class A single-family neighborhoods in particular have used their privilege to build a wall of money around our public investments in transit, infrastructures, and schools. This conflicts with the Comprehensive Plan Policy 2.3, which instructs the city to ensure plans and investments promote environmental justice by extending the community benefits associated with environmental assets, land use, and public investments to communities of color, low-income populations, and other underserved or underrepresented groups impacted by the decision. When the residential infill project passes, neighborhoods that have previously been able to restrict access to community benefits by refusing to build housing will now join the rest of the city in doing their fair share to make Policy 2.3 a reality. Portland Neighbors Welcome supports the residential infill project as one piece of a much larger suite of policies to repair the damage done by a century of racist planning and land use decisions. We look forward to a vote on the proposal in the spring, and we're eager to work with community organizations, BPS staff, and elected officials to make sure it's implemented in a manner that best addresses our housing crisis while simultaneously addressing wealth and racial inequality head-on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Could you tell me who Portland Neighbors Welcome, what is that?
It's me and Madeline Kovacs and Henry Kramer and Tony Jordan and other people that have been generally involved in transportation and housing policy in Portland.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I'm wondering if you have an opinion on the issue that Commissioner Fritz raised about allowing increased density in areas that are not transit-rich, because I'm somewhat of two minds about that. While I agree we want to concentrate density in areas where transit exists, we'll never get, at the rate TriMet is going, we'll never get improved and increased transit in those less dense areas without the density. So there's just this constant rub between dealing with the current circumstances on the ground and trying to improve upon and plan for future need.
Yeah, and I completely understand that. I think, something's got to go first, and when we look at where to put transit improvements, often we look at where the most, the highest density of people are, or highest density of people are who are not currently being served. So, it's chicken and the egg. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I think we just can't really predict that much, and I don't think we should try to shape it to that degree, because we just don't know what future transit improvements are going to look like.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rose O'Heather. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development for Hacienda CDC. Hacienda CDC is an affordable housing provider and also a provider of social service supports for our residents. And we also provide economic development opportunities and economic opportunities for homeowners in and around the Cully and throughout the Northeast Portland area. And I'm here to just share my support for the residential infill project and Hacienda support for as well. We are, we're dealing with a housing crisis. I'm talking to folks every day who are coming in and desperate for housing, and our waiting lists are closed. And we need the residential infill project to incentivize homeowners to create more affordable housing in their communities. And not just in gentrifying communities, but communities throughout the city of Portland, where so many low-income and persons of color have been excluded in the past. So we definitely support the residential infill project. But we agree that it's very important to also ensure that public subsidy is made available to homeowners who do create affordable housing units. We already have the SDC exceptions. But we are also pursuing, public subsidies wherever we can for affordable housing units. And homeowners who develop affordable housing units through the residential infill project are going to need the same level of public support. And we're particularly supportive of the bonuses that are going to be offered for additional affordable housing units. You asked earlier about affordable housing and what that means. For us, it's creating affordable rental housing for those who are earning 60% of AMI or less. And for the city of Portland has a policy right now of creating as much affordable housing for those who are earning 30% of income or less. I do want to talk to you a little bit about a program that we are involved in right now ahead of the residential infra project, which we feel could also take advantage of the residential project should it pass, and we hope it does. We are calling it our Equity First Affordable Home Rental Development Program, and it's basically assisting homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods like Cully, close in Northeast Portland, East Portland, to create accessory dwelling units in their backyards. Hacienda would serve as the project manager and developer so that we can bring in professional development expertise to that homeowner and bring in all the resources that we can access, including a public subsidy, which we are pursuing through the state of Oregon at this time. And with that, we are asking homeowners to create an affordable ADU unit for those earning 60% of AMI or less. We are also going to be working with lending partners who are going to create loan products. You mentioned Craft 3 earlier. They're one of our partners, and we are working with them to create loan products that are going to be very affordable to these homeowners. We held our first homeowner focus group last week and heard directly from the homeowners. And it was unanimous. All of them are supportive of getting some trusted, affordable housing developer to help them develop these ADU units. And then also they were excited about the possibility of getting additional public subsidy to help them make these ADU units affordable to their renters. Many of them talked about being able to help out their family member. Many of them also expressed real fears about retirement for those who are older adults and how they were going to be able to sustain living in their communities unless they had a strategy for bringing in more revenue. And this is one strategy I think can be very effective. We shared with them the possibility of having them, in the case of the older adult, moving into the ADU unit and renting out the larger home. So with the residential infill project, we'd be able to potentially develop 2 ADU units, and then maybe help the homeowners who have larger lots develop, 4-plexes and 6-plexes and 8-plexes potentially.
So, ma'am,
Yes.
I'm trying to understand what the program would do. So if I'm a senior who am an empty nester, I would hire your CDC to build me an ADU in my backyard. Then I would
Correct.
rent out my house to a family that needed it. And then there would be a public subsidy to reduce the rent.
Yes.
And that public subsidy would be paid to who?
Well, either the family would bring their own subsidy, depending on programs that get developed for homeowners, or we would obtain the subsidy that we would use to reduce the construction costs and therefore reduce their loan for the ADU unit or other rental.
I'm sorry, so the subsidy would be for the ADU unit?
It would be used to reduce the loan amount that would be needed for the ADU unit, and therefore make the ADU unit affordable to those earning 60% of area median income or less.
But this person would be a retired person, right? So
Correct.
they would have a fixed income anyway.
Correct.
And their living expenses would be reduced because now they're not living in a big house where they're paying utilities and
Correct.
all the other stuff. They're
Right.
living in this little place.
Correct.
And so I'm still trying to figure out about the subsidy, right? It's like if you're getting the rent,
Mm-hmm.
what's the subsidy for? Right? The rent would be paying back the loan, wouldn't it?
Well, the ADU unit would cost about $130,000 approximately. Yes, for an ADU
That's
unit,
low.
a stick-built ADU
That's
unit,
low.
yes. Yes, yes. No, no. Well, and then
Well-
the subsidy would come in to either directly to the homeowner or through the nonprofit to reduce the construction costs and reduce the loan that would be needed for the ADU unit. The rental income from the ADU unit would basically absorb that cost for the loan and then also provide some cash flow to the homeowner. That's if they decided to just stay in their home and rent out the ADU unit. On the other hand, they could move into the ADU unit and rent out the potentially larger home and have more revenue from that home.
I learned so much sitting on this side of this table. I thank you. Man, I thought I was with it, but I was really out in left field. I thought less than 50,000 for ADU.
Yeah, no,
What are
they've
you
gotten
guys
really
building
expensive.
now? What are you
Construction
building?
Labor costs have gotten very expensive for construction.
And I think a lot of people think that ADUs are going to be exponentially cheaper than full-size homes based on square footage. Well, no, but you still have the expense of plumbing and wiring and the heating system. None of that is considerably cheaper than in a full-sized
Right.
home. The benefit is fitting more units onto that
Right.
that lot, and the average price home is $400,000 or more in Portland, so 130, while quite high, is still much lower than constructing a full-size home. I'm really excited about the potential that you're talking about. I'm wondering what RIP might do for other affordable housing developers like Habitat for Humanity, Proud Ground, your own, because you do your own developments as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
What might that mean?
Yeah, we tend to do larger developments and creating smaller developments has not typically been in our, area of interest, but with the residential infrastructure project, we have to reconsider that. And we are talking to our legislators, and we are talking to Oregon Housing and also the Portland Housing Bureau and Prosper Portland about, changing administrative rules that would allow for these subsidies to be used for these smaller developments. And we can do that with homeowners, and we could also do that with rental properties as well. So we've been working on this for about a year, and there is a lot of interest in supporting that. So not only from the city standpoint, but also from the state standpoint.
So thank you very much for being here today. It's very helpful. We have 35 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have time to present what the residential infill recommendations are to the city council. So with
Thank
that,
you.
I'm going to ask Sandra Wood and Morgan Tracy from BPS to walk through that for everyone.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Mayor and Commissioners, I am going to skip us ahead a few slides and not share as much background and get you to slide 15.
15, okay.
15 is the slide that starts about state legislation. And so we kind of have four things to talk about. We need to work pretty quickly. This is a work session for you. So we have state legislation, the proposals themselves, the economics around the proposal, and then displacement risk analysis. I'm going to go ahead and start from the top, from that. So as we've been working on residential infill project for about 4 years now, the state has also been working on state legislation, and they have passed 2 bills that directly affect the work that we're doing, or that really actually mirror the work that we're doing. And I wanted to clarify for the council what flexibility you had and make sure that you understand what the 2 state bills require and where they give us wiggle room. So moving on to slide number 16, the House Bill 2001, which is called the Middle Housing Bill, requires that cities allow middle housing in land zone for single-family dwellings. Then it defines what it means by middle housing and have different rules for each. So this slide concentrates on what is required of duplexes as a middle housing type. The bill requires us to allow duplexes on all lots where houses are allowed, and the proposed residential infill project does this by allowing duplexes on all lots in the R2.5, R5, R7 zones, except in the Z overlay. The Z overlay, you haven't heard about yet, and Morgan's going to talk to you about that, but those are basically lots that are constrained in some way. But as far as the state goes, we aren't going far enough with residential infill because we need to allow duplexes on all lots, including the Z. So what we're proposing is that in a future project, we move forward with allowing duplexes in the Z overlay, allowing them in the R10 and R20 zones, and then also developing clear and objective cottage cluster code, which is a different housing type, but those would not be included in residential infill.
Clarification, you would be doing that so that it's ready for June 30th of 2022?
Correct. Since that is the deadline, we have more time to do that, and it's not included in the residential infill package right now. Moving on to slide 17, and triplexes and fourplexes. So this is a different type of middle housing, and the state has different rules for it, and their rules are that we allow it in areas zoned for residential uses, and the residential infill project completely satisfies this by allowing for triplexes and fourplexes on all lots in the R2.5, R5, and R7 zone, except in certain situations that are listed on the slide. So,
And again, clarification, House Bill 2001 doesn't have to allow triplexes and fourplexes on all lots. It's just
Correct.
in all areas. So the example that was given to me at a conference I went to is that we could allow them just on corners, for example, or we could use, they're going to be putting out rules as to what an area is.
right. That's exactly right. So duplexes, we don't have much flexibility. Triplexes and fourplexes, we do. The commission's recommendations for triplexes and fourplexes is much more broad than what the state requires.
Thank you.
So we've got some flexibility there. Slide 18, this is a different a different bill that came out of the legislature. This is Senate Bill 534. This got a lot less press. And it is effective sooner, as Commissioner Fritz has told us. It's effective, reminded us, it's effective on March 1st of 2020. And even if we don't pass rules by March 1st of 2020, Bureau of Development Services will need to be implementing the state bill, which isn't particularly clear about what standards should apply. So we've been working with them on what that will look like, and I'll walk you through that. Basically, the state bill requires that cities allow at least one dwelling unit on each platted lot that is zoned for a single-family dwelling. Again, we mostly address this for the majority of lots, and we did that by doing two things that the Planning Commission was already talking about. There are about 14,000 small lots in the city. The Planning Commission's recommending that we rezone half of them from R5 to R2.5. Those are the ones that are closest to commercial corridors and services and are well-served by transit. The other half, retaining the R.
Excuse me, could I just
Yes.
ask probably a stupid question? What is a platted lot?
Going back, way back when with what you were talking about before, with the homesteads in Portland, whenever a property owner was going to subdivide lots and sell them to a bunch of different owners, and they plat the lot. They go through a subdivision process, and that's called a platting process.
Okay.
So it's a
and-
subdivision in essence. But these are old subdivisions that were done in the 1920s and 30s when the original streetcar era neighborhoods were created in inner East Side.
Actually, in 1889, the one in my neighborhood. So they were actually real estate scams. That they divided up the lots on paper to look like you could buy a 25 by 100 lot and put a cabin in this lovely area that's only 7 miles from Portland. But they didn't note that it was on a steep slope in a ravine, and you actually couldn't get from what is now West Portland Park to Portland at that time.
Oh, I saw something on TV recently about somebody who had bought this. He thought that they had bought land, but what they'd actually bought was somebody's driveway, right? And he had the deed to that driveway. So he actually owned like a little square area.
Yeah.
So he would come with his chair and just sit in the driveway because it's like I own it. So
So just for some
Interesting.
context,
Thank you.
because I've been working on this for 20 years or more, these lots currently are zoned R5, one per 5,000 square foot or one per 7,000 square foot. This bill said we have to allow one per 2,500 square foot, regardless of where they are, regardless of where there are constraints or whether. Again, we went through the process with the comprehensive plan to look at where does it make sense to rezone to 2.5. This is a top-down requirement by the state, but it does say that we can, we're not required to do it where there are natural resource constraints, not including historic resources. So
That's
when you
correct.
bring it to us in the session, would you show us where the environmental zones are in relation to the skinny lot plats, please?
Yes, we will do that. So the takeaway here is that the commission's recommendation largely takes care of this. We estimate for about 85% of the narrowly platted lots throughout the city. And I do want to clarify, some of them were real estate scams, like the top of OHSU has tons of plats of single-family residential lots. Yes. But then there are also other neighborhoods where there a lot in St. John's, for example, where you see houses on 50 by 100, a traditional neighborhood lot, but underneath, there's 2 lots underneath it. And those people's deeds say Block 5, lots 2 and 3 of such subdivision. They were not developed normally at 25 by 100.
And what was happening 20 years ago was there was a lot of demolition and displacement in North Portland, Northeast Portland, because one of our predecessors allowed developers to develop on the skinny lots. And so since then, we've had regulations that you have to wait 5 years if you're going to develop on one half of it to try to discourage demolitions, and it has done that. This is now taking that away, so we can expect to see a lot more demolitions again.
So the takeaway here is that we're taking care of it mostly. We do expect and hope for an amendment. We're recommending that a council member has an amendment to develop a process where we can determine if a lot has steeply sloping lots, floodplain, et cetera, in a clear and objective way so that Bureau of Development Services can implement.
The other question, it says in the bill that we're not required to consider whether the amendments significantly affect transportation facilities, but that implies that we are allowed to consider that. Are we allowed to consider transportation adequacy?
I think the bill was, that provision of the bill is when we change the zoning rules, we have to make findings and do infrastructure analysis for all of that. That's the out that it's giving us. That when we're coming through with city council with legislation, that we don't have to look at the transportation planning rule at the state level.
But we could.
Yes.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Morgan so he can actually tell you what the residential infill recommendations and project is about.
Great, thanks, Sandra. So I've got about, less than 25 minutes, so I'll try to rush through this a little bit, but please jump in if I'm moving a little too fast. But I first want to say I'd be remiss if I didn't express how excited I am to be here. It's been about 4 years worth of work. We've had a lot of great conversations in all corners of the city, and all those conversations have really helped shape and improve the proposals, the recommendations that we're bringing to you. The first recommendation, of course, and we've heard a lot about this already, is the increased range of allowed housing types. So in this slide on page 20, the top 2 types are the house with the ADU and a duplex we already allow, but we currently limit duplexes to corner lots. House Bill 2001 will require that these be allowed on all lots where a house is allowed. The 2 types on the far right, the triplex and the fourplex, are new for single dwelling zones. House Bill 2001 requires that these be allowed in some places, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And the last 2, the house with 2 ADUs and the duplex with ADU, are also new and are intended to encourage additional ADU creation, but are not required by House Bill 2001. So this is one of the areas where residential infill is going beyond that House bill. If we take a step back, you'll see that these new housing types are variations on the theme of 3 and 4 units, but retain a single primary structure and present themselves in more of a house-like form. On the next slide, slide 21, the second recommendation is about where these housing options should be allowed. So this has been a hotly debated issue. The Planning and Sustainability Commission is recommending to allow these housing types in most of the single-dwelling areas of the city, shown in yellow on the map. In particular, they wanted to give low-income homeowners the opportunity to use these new provisions to build wealth, and also increase the area where lower-cost housing can be built. So a lot of the conversations we were having earlier about why did the commission expand beyond the quarter mile, part of that was to expand into neighborhoods that weren't served by transit, but are still relatively close to the central city. The map is excluding areas in gray. These are areas of the city that are zoned very low density because of environmental constraints and lack infrastructure. And it also excludes the pink areas, and these are areas of the city that are zoned single dwelling, but are identified with natural resources inventoried, the 100-year floodplain, or are in landslide areas, so natural resources and natural hazards, essentially. There's one additional limitation on where the triplexes and fourplexes would be allowed, which pertains to whether the lot is on an unmaintained street, whether the street is paved. This limitation is in the code and is not mapped, as the street condition is more dynamic and subject to change more frequently. So as streets become improved, those lots on those streets would be eligible for a triplex or fourplex.
So that means Southwest and East Portland wouldn't have to worry about this, right? 'Cause
They'll
they don't
still,
have sidewalks.
they'll still have duplexes as the House bill is requiring, but not triplexes and fourplexes until those improvements are made. So that's part of our couple ways of getting at that, either through capital investments or through private investment. One of the incentives for people adding infrastructure is to be able to do some of these additional housing types. Moving to the next slide, slide 22, the third proposal is to reduce the scale of development based on the number of units that are in the building. Because we are varying the size of structures, the recommendation is to measure size by floor to area ratios, FAR, like we'll now be doing in all of our other zones. This is something new for single dwelling zones, but it's becoming a sort of more consistent measurement for all the development in our base zones. People sometimes confuse floor area with building coverage. So when we're talking about building coverage, it's a two-dimensional envelope about how much of the lot is being occupied by the building. Floor area, the easiest way to think about floor area, am I behind?
No,
Oh.
slide is.
Interesting. Sorry. Floor area, the easiest way to think about this is if you were going to ask to have all the, you were going to order carpet for all the rooms in your house, that's floor area, right? And that, if you think about floor area ratio, it's taking that number and dividing by your lot size. So 2,000 square feet of carpet on a 5,000 square foot lot is rats. It's about,
2,500 square.
yeah, close enough, 0.5 FAR. Bad math, sorry. Structures would be allowed more square footage with each additional unit. So for example, on a typical R5 lot, a house can be 2,500 square feet, a duplex 3,000 square feet, while a triplex or fourplex can be 3,500 square feet. The proposal currently includes an FAR bonus if one of those units is affordable, so an additional 0.1 FAR, or essentially 500 square feet in these examples.
And what's affordable?
Thank you. Affordable is measured at 80% MFI and below. Still, the overall size of the building that's allowed, even with 4 units, and even with the bonus, is less than what's allowed today for one big house. On the next slide, slide 23, for context, this is showing a range of house sizes on 5,000 square foot lots. What we're seeing is on the left is a typical older Portland home at about 1,500 square feet. On the far right is the largest house one can build under today's code, which is about 6,700 square feet, or 1.35 FAR when you do the math. The largest house built in 2015 was just over 4,400 square feet, and we are proposing a maximum size of 0.5 FAR, or 2,500 square feet, which is shown in the green house in the middle. The next proposal, on slide 24, is about historically narrow lots. So coming back to Commissioner Fritz's point around platted subdivisions. So these are subdivisions that predate zoning, typically 25 by 100 foot lots, which are mostly in the R5 zone. There's about 14,000 of them. The Planning Commission is recommending rezoning about half of the ones that are near centers and corridors to R2.5. The other R5 would stay zoned R5 and still could be developed with attached houses, but at a lower height and a smaller scale.
But what about the ones that are in their R7?
So pertaining to the Senate bill in R7, they would also be allowed to be developed if they meet the criteria around constraints. So the test for infrastructure, natural hazards, slopes, et cetera.
So one of the things I think we should consider, colleagues, is whether to rezone those to R2.5, because you then get attached units rather than detached units, which is more energy efficient, even though it's still putting people where they can't get anywhere.
So we can talk about that, the idea for that amendment. One of the concerns that staff has around a rezone of the lots is we lose the ability to apply those constraints that the Senate bill is giving us that sort of infrastructure test for.
But that's on a building permit by building permit
Yes.
basis. And in West Portland Park, there was a case back 1970s where it was determined that the sewer that's at the bottom of Arnold Creek couldn't handle developments at R2, actually couldn't handle developments at R5. So there's the question, a single development is not going to require an upgrade to that sewer, but if you allow the whole area to develop at this higher density, then somebody is going to have to cause a great amount of environmental damage to dig up that sewer and put in a new one. And it wouldn't be just the one property owner, it would probably fall upon the city. So I think that we should have some discussion about these constrained areas, which the bill does allow, to exclude some areas where we know that there are infrastructure constraints as plan areas.
So Commissioners, we have about 15 minutes left, and I know there was a lot of conversation about displacement risk, and I want to take advantage of your interest in that and move us along to that. The whole next section that you'll have slides for, and we'll be happy to talk to you more about, is about annual income and housing costs. These slides should look fairly familiar to you because you saw them during the Better Housing by Design project. We did add a couple columns on the far right to get a little upper in scale to 140 and 160% MFI, and then took your comments to heart that you had for Better Housing by Design. It's like, well, who earns that amount of money, and matched them to the housing types that are being proposed for residential infill. But why don't we go ahead and skip to slide 33, so that Morgan can describe what the analysis was with the displacement risk analysis, especially since we can take advantage of having Commissioner Schultz here to answer more questions about it.
Well, that was very expedient. Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty, one of the questions you'd asked early on with the first part of the presentation was, what's different this time? I think it's important to highlight, this is a little bit about what's different. We are intentionally going in and analyzing the risk of displacement, going in eyes wide open, and daylighting that information so we can make better informed decisions. On slide 33, in terms of the displacement conversation, I think it's also helpful to structure the conversation around the types of displacement, which was a little bit of the mayor's question about who are we talking about. For this particular displacement risk analysis, we were focused on what we call indirect displacement, which is the displacement caused by redevelopment activity spurred by changes in regulations and zoning. There's also direct displacement, which is more akin to eminent domain, when you're acquiring right-of-way and removing property, displacing individuals that way. And then the other sort of more difficult type of displacement to quantify, especially to project 10, 20 years into the future, is induced displacement. So this is when you make an investment in an area, provide a park, improve the streets, and that changes the property values and the market dynamics in that area. So just in terms of what this analysis is focused on, it is that indirect displacement. What are the zone changes doing in terms of redevelopment and demolition activity? So to do this, we identified which properties would be likely to redevelop and where they are located. So the map on the right-hand side of this slide is showing 3 broad market areas with similar ranges of attainable sales and rent prices. There are the inner neighborhoods in sort of that darker color, which are neighborhoods like Richmond, Buckman, and Boys. The middle neighborhoods, Kenton, Coley, Foster, and Powell, for example, and outer neighborhoods like Park Rose and Powellhurst, Gilbert. The middle geography, that sort of medium color, is where you see most of the development activity being predicted under the residential infill, and you'll see that reflected in the next slide. Next, we focused on who was impacted, and for this particular analysis, we were most interested in low-income renters in single-family structures and single-family zones. Of course, we wanted to put a racial lens on that. It gets challenging with the data that's available, putting households of color with renters with single-family structures and low-income all together. So we used the low-income as sort of a proxy for that question, so understanding that. So these are the folks that have the least say in decisions whether the property redevelops, and when they are displaced, have the most difficulty finding resettlement in the same neighborhood. So this is really kind of our critical population in terms of the impact from this project. So on the next slide, this map is showing a comparison of the projected growth for current zoning compared to the residential infill project. Cooler colors show less change or reduction in projected growth, while warmer colors show where additional units are projected. So I mentioned sort of that middle geography, and you can kind of see that arc extending from St. John's down along the I-205 corridor is pretty reflective of that.
So
We
I
haven't-
just want to make sure I'm reading this right. So the red area, oh, sorry. So the red area is an area where you do not anticipate much changes taking place?
Opposite of that. So where you have cooler colors, you see either net same amount of housing units being produced or a reduction. So if you look at Pleasant Valley, there's actually fewer housing units predicted in Pleasant Valley. Whereas the areas around Lentz, along the I-205 corridor, Lentz and Montevilla, and out into St. John's, and along Division out East Portland, you see slightly higher numbers of units than the default comprehensive plan, current zoning. Does that make sense?
Got it, yeah, I got it, thanks.
So our next task was to take those numbers, oops.
Sorry.
Oh.
We're both doing it.
Our next task was to take both those numbers and look at the specific share of low-income renters in each of the affected census tracts to forecast whether there was a net increase or decrease in potential displacement. Overall, there was a 28% reduction in displacement. There were fewer one-for-one demolitions. So when we saw demolitions, we saw more units being produced in those instances, and more smaller and less expensive units being produced. There were the three neighborhoods that showed an increase in displacement over current zoning, which we've talked about previously: Lentz, Brentwood, Darlington, and Montevilla east of 82nd. I think it's important to keep in context, just in terms of what these numbers are reflecting. The increase averaged about 1 to 2 additional households per year, forecasted over a 20-year period. So I think part of what the Planning Commission struggled with was we had a lot of information put at them at the very end of the long deliberation process, and we were still trying to get our minds around what the results were showing us. This is a good indication of where we need to be cautious. We see increases in displacement here as an indicator, but we also have to keep in mind the sort of unspoken part of this analysis is where displacement is already high, and even though it's reduced, is still potentially higher than these areas that we're highlighting here.
And my question is that 28% reduction, who is being displaced? Who will be displaced based on this plan as written?
What's the difference in?
Well, you're saying that we're going to reduce displacement, right? But that means that we're reducing it by 28%. So there's a certain percentage of the population that you're anticipating will be displaced.
Correct.
Once this plan is implemented, right?
Correct.
Who is that? Who are those people?
Right, and so all we were measuring with this displacement risk analysis is low-income renters who are renting single-family houses in single-family zones.
So can we not assume we're talking people of color, primarily, being displaced?
We are talking about people of color and white people too.
But again, if we're saying that we're going to reduce displacement by 28%, then you have a number in your mind about the percentage of people who will be displaced.
Yeah,
But we're going to reduce it less. And so there's a certain segment of the population that you have not you personally, but this process says these people will be displaced. We already know it, but we're going to reduce the likelihood of displacement by 28%. And so my question to you is, what do those people look like that are going to be displaced? And how many people are we talking? And what is that percentage?
Joe, you look like you
Well,
have
yeah,
a
just the 28% reduction is 28% reduction compared to if we just stayed with our existing zoning and did nothing.
So what would happen without existing zoning? How many, what's the percentage of people who would be displaced in these current neighborhoods if we just did nothing?
You know, I'm going to need to get back to you because I just don't recall the.
Actually, I'm looking at the report right now. So the report says that through 2035, there's 600, with residential infill, 680 low-income renters in single-family houses at risk of displacement.
680?
Yes, compared to 950 such renters under the current zoning.
So that's the universe, Commissioner, too. We're looking at low-income renters in single-family houses.
Ah, got it.
See what I'm saying? So it's just one slice.
Got
And the question you asked about race, the census, the data that we have available doesn't break it down, but what we ended up doing, and I think that's, I'm not sure it's reflected in this, we said, okay, we looked at which census tracts have a greater concentration of people of color than others. So we know what that universe was.
Right.
And there's a good, actually, even for the census tracts where there's a greater concentration of people of color, then the displacement goes down for those as well.
And it goes down by 21%.
Right. So if you just look at that citywide, which of these census tracts has a greater concentration of people of color, even though that population of renters, these 900 households, has less displacement. But in those three neighborhoods, because of the land economics, really, it's different, and it's different in what kind of numbers, Sandra?
In those three areas?
Yeah.
Do you have the three areas? I have for the area, the census tracts that have a higher percentage of vulnerable population, the overall numbers decreased by 21%. So that's 610 households goes down to 480 households with this project. And then those three areas.
So these are people, these are low-income people who are renting houses today. So if the owner decided today that they were going to tear their house down and build 4 new ones, the potential of those 610 households who are just renters would get the relocation assistance, and that would be it. And so technically, they would be displaced.
But it's over 20 years. So the analysis is that those numbers are over a 20-year period.
Right. And today, by having more, this is part of how, by having more unit choices, smaller units in inner neighborhoods, the likelihood that someone's going to go out and bid up the price of the Lentz house so that they can tear it down to build a big house reduces, because there's neighborhoods that have more of the stuff they want, that there's more choices in. So we're taking the pressure. That's what we're trying to say when we take the pressure off of Lentz by increasing housing choices in other neighborhoods. And so it's really hard to parse that apart. That's why our numbers seem maybe a little squishy, but and we're talking about tens of households a year citywide.
But if you just did the inner core, which is what the policy says in the planning commission, in the comprehensive plan, you would get the benefits without the impacts on the lower income neighbourhoods in East Portland.
Okay. So moving on to the slide 36. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So how exactly is displacement risk reduced by the project? And part of this is understanding we have several dials to turn in this project, right? We can increase the number of units, affect the number of units that are allowed on lot, and I think you heard some interesting ideas introduced today about increasing the number beyond 4, adjusting the size of the building, and adjusting where these additional housing types are allowed. So today, we allow 1 to 2 units in a very, very large building on a lot, basically everywhere in these zones. The project increases the number of allowed units, and which reduces the number of sites that are needed to redevelop to meet our housing supply numbers. So if we're thinking about 16,000 houses being projected in the single dwelling zones, 16,000 incidences of development, some number of those are going to affect or impact and cause the demolition of an existing house. So trying to achieve that 16,000 number with duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes means something more like 4,000 to 8,000 incidences of development. So it reduces that sort of potential likelihood. And the second lowers the allowable floor area, which reduces the incentive and feasibility to redevelop. So we've done a couple interesting things with this project by, we hear this is an up zone. Well, it is an up zone in terms of numbers of units, but it's a significant down zone in terms of the total square footage you can put on a lot. So these two things are working with each other, and based on the economic analysis we've come out with, we still have something that's economically feasible and still produces lower priced homes in comparison to the large single-family home at 170% MFI.
That's one of my, I don't know if favorite is the right word, but one of the aspects of this I really like. I spoke at the Multnomah Neighborhood Association last night, and I think we all know there's a lot of heartburn in the community about beautiful old homes being torn down and replaced with giant McMansions. And so we are really eliminating that potential. You cannot tear, it's the one-to-one. You can't tear down a modest home and build a massive home. You can tear down a modest home and build 2 or more units, but it's still ultimately smaller, right?
Smaller.
Right.
I mean, I have 1,000 square feet and it's plenty. I don't know what these people are doing with 6,000 square foot houses, but that's their
Well, to be
concern.
clear also, we haven't seen anyone build a 6,000 square foot house.
44.
4,400
Yeah,
square feet.
sorry,
Yes, we have seen
44.
that. But 6,000 was a lot.
Joe, you mentioned how important supply is, and I want to dig into that a little bit. We know that we've added thousands and thousands of units to our housing supply, but because the vast majority, like over 90% of them, are at the upper end, cost-wise, that has resulted in very little benefit for people who are earning under 100 or 120% of MFI, and almost no relief for lower income people. So all along, I've told you, one of my concerns, my big concern is, can we generate the numbers of units that we need and the levels of rent that we actually need? Do we have any sense of what the potential is for housing built in the private market that's going to fall into that 60 to 100% MFI, knowing that current market rate rents are only affordable to people earning 120% of MFI or above?
Well, I think if it's reasonable to say 60% is not accomplishable without
Subsidy.
subsidy.
Yeah.
And, for a long time, a decade ago, we were wondering why Lentz housing was slow to take off, because median rents in Lentz were, 80%. They were less. But this changes rapidly, and that's what you're seeing happen. So by increasing the choices and the private sector development is going to develop housing where they think they can get the rents that they want, and they can have low vacancy rates, and they can pay back the lenders and do that quickly. And so often these inner neighborhood locations, a little bit it goes back to greenlining, are more attractive to be able to generate that rent, even though they're building these really small units. So they're going to attract more development there maybe sooner, and that's a little bit what we've seen. But now it's creeping out to the east as well. But now also rents are sort of stabilizing because the market overbuilt a little bit or is on the edge of it. The more units we are allowed to be built in more neighborhoods means that the units out east in some of these neighborhoods where the rents haven't quite gotten up to be as attractive as others can stay at the level they are. Is that protecting affordable housing? No, but it's sort of fundamental to keeping the whole city from becoming unaffordable. Is that making sense?
I mean, it's a theory. right?
It's just looking at the economics of it. You have to have things like you all have actually done, produce as much affordable housing as we can. The step into renter protection is another part of this tool. Getting land bought in advance of development is another part of this. That's what
Yeah.
the kind of things that are in the anti-displacement strategy. But on the zoning piece, increasing supply and doing it more than we think we need is one of the best things we can do.
I have two quick questions, Bill. One is, are you seeing now a slowdown in the housing market?
Well, yeah, just based on the reports, rents are slowing down, projects are going on hold. How long does this last? How widespread this is last? And actually, I don't have my data, Commissioner, to say across all product types, but the multifamily market rents are stabilizing. They're
Well,
not growing.
rents, no, I'm not talking rent. I'm just talking strictly, are we building less now? The private sector, is the private sector slowing down as it relates to building housing, just in general?
I don't know. I would want to go check my number before I gave you that answer.
I would
But we can
appreciate
get
that
Commissioner.
because I'm not a real estate expert, but I think it's slowing down just based on what I see, how many cranes I see up in the air nowadays. And so I guess if we're assuming that, this can't go on forever, right? We can't be having this building boom forever. If we assume that at some point it's going to slow down, way down, what are the incentives to take these big, beautiful homes and break them into apartments versus tearing down these homes and then building 2, 4, 6 little ones?
Well, I think part of that starts with the question around how big those beautiful homes are. So if they're already near or exceeding what's allowed in terms of square footage, you're not going to see those being, there's a built-in incentive to retain what you have. Otherwise, you're losing value by tearing that property down.
Because
yeah,
you can't
well,
build something as big.
But I mean, if it's the choice between a single empty nester, right, who's living in this big, beautiful house, the kids don't live in the state, so the choice is between selling it or dividing it so that it becomes home for more people, right? I don't see that. I see a developer's incentive to tear it down, right? Because then they could sell 6 rather than just 1.
But they'll be smaller. So
They would be smaller.
even if a developer does purchase it, if it's a larger house, which Morgan's getting into, that already exceeds the limits we're putting on there, then they can get 4 units that are larger units.
So I guess what I'm getting at is if we say that we value older homes, if we say that we are limiting what people can build, right, size-wise, right? I think there would be a big incentive for some developer type to be going to these big homes and actually trying to figure out how do you divide it in a way that you could have multi-families living in that property, right? And quite frankly, if in fact we are slowing down on development, that's going to be the next trend that people are going to be trying to figure out how do you take these big ones and not tear them down, but just like cut them up into little pieces, right? To make it more accessible for more people. So of course, we don't know, right? I don't have a crystal ball to say, okay, this time in 3 months, right, the housing market is going to be dead, so this is going to be the new thing, right? I can't say that.
Well, they can't do it right now because it's not allowed yet.
We can't do it now because it's not allowed?
Right, because this project hasn't passed yet. If it's in a single dwelling zone,
Well, but if I have a
general-
single house and I wanted to divide it, I couldn't do that today?
That's correct. Without this project, you can't.
Well, how rude.
That's what you get to decide.
That's why you might not be seeing them, too.
I tell you, I learned so much today here.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
If you had a corner lot, you could do
A duplex,
Duplex.
under
right.
current zoning.
Right.
But nowhere else.
And nothing more.
That,
So we have
exactly.
one last slide just to kind of summarize next steps and timeline, and then we can wrap this up because I know we're a little bit past our time. So Sandra.
Yeah, so for the whole Housing Opportunities Initiative, we are on slide 39, which is our closing slide. We've got Better Housing by Design, right after this, and then the vote on December 18th for residential infill, this conversation, the next time we'll see you is at the public hearing on January 15th. We're doing 2 back-to-back hearings, 15th and 16th, and then your first work session will be on January 29th, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Anti-displacement action plan, the inter-bureau work group has already launched and began meeting in November, and the community code-led task force will be launched summer of next year.
Great. Does that complete your presentation?
That completes our presentation. Thank you very much for your patience this afternoon.
Well done. I apologize. I was multitasking throughout, but it was a very good presentation. We are adjourned for 10 minutes until our 4:45 time, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.